Welcome, everyone, this is your friend, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of, what if Loki's redemption was Thor's worst idea ever? A special shout out to the original creator, Sarah1281. Please make sure to show your support by checking out their work from the description. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Waiting in a cell for his not-father to decide his punishment was decidedly dull, but it was preferable to what was now breaking that precious silence. Namely, Thor's boots thundering through the mostly empty cell block towards Loki. He wondered what it said about him that he could distinguish Thor's footsteps from those of others. Most likely nothing. Most likely Thor just thundered everywhere he went with no concept of stealth. And he wondered why Loki had never let him tag along when he needed to be quiet. He rose and stood calmly waiting for what was to come. He wasn't quite sure how it would go, but the odds were good that he would rather that it didn't happen. "Loki!" Thor exclaimed happily as he burst into view, as if he had half expected that Loki wouldn't still be there. Oh, if only. Loki did not deign to respond aside from glaring at Thor. It would seem that Thor still hadn't gotten the message that Loki had no intention of returning to the way that things were. If that were even possible, and honestly he rather doubted it. On the one hand, it annoyed him that Thor wouldn't just give it up already. On the other, he suspected he would be even more irritated if Thor ever did stop trying. Just because it was a futile effort was no excuse for Thor to give up on the man he still insisted was his brother, after all. "Father has decided what is to become of you," Thor announced. Loki started at that unexpected bit of news. "I've only been back for 2 hours. "That is true," Thor agreed. "But we have been thinking about this since we first heard word that you were still alive." "So what is it going to be?" Loki demanded. "Am I to be imprisoned forever, stripped of my powers and banished as you were? Is my mind going to be destroyed? Shall I be outright executed?" Thor had been listening with growing horror. "No, of course not. Whatever made you think that?" "Do I really need to recite the litany of my crimes?" Loki asked, raising an eyebrow. "You seemed to have a good grasp on them earlier before I was escorted here." "Well, yes," Thor conceded. "You did a great deal of damage. Still, you're my brother and our father's son, and so allowances must be made." "Aren't you even going to pretend you're not engaging in blatant nepotism?" Loki asked, pinching the bridge of his nose and glancing down. Thor blinked. "I don't see why I should. It is obvious that if you were anyone else then you would be punished far harsher. Everyone knows this and accepts it as perfectly natural. It would be insulting of everyone's intelligence to pretend otherwise." Loki supposed that that had always been the case when they were younger. If he had been anyone else he would have been banned from the palace and virtually everywhere else he had cared to go. There had even been an incident with some dwarves once who had completely overreacted and wanted to sew his mouth shut until Thor had shown up and started smashing things. He could always be relied on to do that. Even when he had refused to help Loki destroy Jotunheim he had been amenable to smashing things, though the Bifrost was a rather unfortunate target. "This is a bit more serious than anything we've done before," Loki told him. Thor shrugged. "The same principle still holds. Some people were a little surprised that we were even punishing you at all." Loki just stared at him. "You're not serious." Thor scratched the back of his head awkwardly. "Your scheme to destroy Jotunheim was surprisingly popular with the people, as was your killing of Loki. And they were not particularly concerned about Midgard, either. Earth. Well, that was certainly interesting." He chose to ignore the unexpected popular support in favor of focusing on what he considered to be the relevant part. "So I see they would like to see all Jotun killed. Can you not understand why I would not want to return here?" "It's like we're having two different conversations," Thor marveled. He sighed. "Come now, brother. You're the one who actually sought genocide. They just don't disapprove. Besides, they don't know about that." "Why not?" Loki asked flippantly. "They seem to know everything else." "It just somehow never came up," Thor said uncomfortably. "If you want him to know then they can, but we'll leave that decision up to you." Loki nodded curtly, knowing that he would never do any such thing, and Thor and Odin had to know that. "Oh, I understand. You're more ashamed that I'm a frost giant than about anything else I've done. I can't say that I think much of your priorities." Thor winced. "That's really not, though, to be fair. I suppose I can't blame you." Loki continued as if Thor had not spoken, when you're a monster it follows that you do monstrous things. I am highly concerned by your constant referral to yourself as a monster, Loki, Thor said seriously. That seems like it would be very psychologically damaging. All I'm doing is not being a hypocrite, Loki claimed. I know all frost giants to be monsters and I myself am a frost giant. The logical conclusion is that I'm a monster. Unless you think that your love can save me, in which case I'll have to advise you to get over yourself, Thor. That sort of stereotyping is troubling, too, Thor added. That sort of stereotyping, Loki repeated. Who are you and what have you done with my BR with Thor? If Thor had noticed his slip-up then he didn't mention it and that only annoyed Loki more. He didn't need Thor treating him like a child. I learned much from my time on Midgard. Loki rubbed his forehead tiredly. Thor, you were gone for 3 days. You had an identity crisis and went crazy in those 3 days, Thor pointed out. That was different, Loki sniffed. I had found out that I was a monster. Under the circumstances, I believe that I reacted almost admirably. There are no circumstances in which your reaction was even remotely sane, Thor said flatly. Besides, I thought that I had killed Father. I had meant that he was dead to me, Loki claimed. Did you really not get that? Thor rolled his eyes. Well, thank you so much for clarifying that after all this time. I had really been distressed thinking that he was really dead all this time. Loki shook his head. Sarcasm doesn't suit you. I think it suits me just fine, Thor disagreed, crossing his arms. Loki decided to let it go. I thought it was implied that he wasn't really dead, he said instead, but you've always been lousy at subtext. Thor looked like he wanted to argue the point but then closed his eyes and shook his head. I'm also concerned that you keep using your for your birth as an excuse for your actions. And why is that? Loki challenged. Isn't it better to be upfront about these things? There are a lot of frost giants who don't do the kinds of things that you do, Thor replied. And you never used to do those kinds of things, either, so it would follow that merely being a frost giant is not the reason. The average frost giant merely does not have the power to do what I did, Loki said contemptuously. Do not take their impotence as proof of their virtue. But you're never going to stop being part frost giant, Thor protested. Loki rolled his eyes. Oh yes. Thor was still in denial. At last you begin to get the picture. Are you really going to claim that you have no choice in the matter and your fine Asgardian upbringing stands no chance against your biological heritage, brother? Thor demanded, a hint of smugness in his tone. He knew that Loki would never be able to say that. Loki growled in annoyance. Don't call me that, he ordered abruptly. Thor blinked in confusion. Don't call you what, Loki? The last time I checked that was your name. Has that changed? No, it has not changed, Loki told him. After so many centuries, changing it now would be ridiculous. Almost like trying to disown your family after just as many centuries, Thor muttered. Well, if your name is still Loki then am I just not allowed to call you that? Far from it, Loki assured him. I really wish that you would call me then I'm afraid that I really do not understand. You didn't call me Loki, Loki informed him, exasperated. You called me brother. Thor blinked again. Oh, did I? The words, Loki, and brother, are practically synonymous to me. But I'm not your brother, Loki cried out. Thor shook his head disappointedly. Loki, we've been over this. Remember that time that I accidentally broke your first staff? You can't just decide that we're not brothers anymore. The only way that had been an accident would be if Thor had suffered some sort of head injury and really thought that Loki's scepter was the sword he was using it as. Oh, I quite agree, he said silkily. Thor eyed him warily. It would seem that he was learning at last. You do? Oh, yes, Loki continued. It's not a matter of not being brother anymore but rather us never having been brothers at all. That's even more impossible, Thor objected. The only impossible thing is our being related at all given that we are from two wildly different species, Loki bit out. I have been talking to my human friends about the concept of adoption, which is much more common on Midgard than Asgard given our lengthier lifespans and advanced healing. They agree with me that you're still my brother. They tried to commiserate with me about it but they still agreed, Thor announced. You seem to have a shockingly narrow definition of family. It's not like you see Loki as your family either. That's because he abandoned me to die, Loki answered promptly. So actions can determine whether someone is family or not, Thor cried out triumphantly. And you've been one of us for years. What kind of family would throw me into an abyss? Loki demanded, narrowing his eyes. A terrible one, I'm sure, Thor replied blandly. But Loki, you know that's not what happened. I know nothing of the sort, Loki argued. You let go of me, Thor exclaimed. I was horrified. You didn't even lose your grip or anything, you just let go. Loki tilted his head curiously. Now why would I do that? Thor shook his head helplessly. I know not. I wish that I did. And I don't even believe you really don't see me as your brother anymore or our parents as our parents. Loki coolly raised an eyebrow. Oh, if you did then why would you keep trying to correct me? Thor asked reasonably. As my brother, you know me well enough to know that you won't ever convince me, and if you were that sure then it wouldn't matter what I thought. Thor did have a point about his own hard-headed nature, but Loki refused to consider his words beyond that. You said that a decision about me has been reached? Loki asked instead, bringing them back to the original point of their discussion which had been lost amidst all of their perpetually unresolved business. Thor appeared thrown by this sudden change of topic, but he quickly recovered. Yes, it has. Loki waited, but Thor did not seem inclined to go on. That meant that Thor either had a problem with Loki's sentence or he knew that Loki would. Well? He prompted. Thor took a deep breath. We're going to redeem you. Loki had had a lot of time since Thor had thrown him into the abyss to think about all of the possible punishments he might face if he was ever caught. He could honestly say, however, that this one had never occurred to him. Sorry, what? We're going to redeem you, Thor said again, more confidence in his voice. You can't just order someone to be redeemed, Loki protested. We just did, Thor pointed out. Well, fine, I suppose that you can, Loki conceded. But you can't expect it to work. Or you shouldn't, at any rate. Why not? Thor asked blankly. Because you can't force someone to become redeemed, Loki burst out. They have to want to. Why wouldn't you want to be? Thor asked, still confused. I haven't done anything wrong, Loki insisted. You attempted multiple genocide, Thor reminded him. I don't see your point, Loki said coolly. My point is that genocide is. Thor trailed off, searching for a strong enough word. Bad, it's bad. Why? Loki inquired innocently. Because killing people is something that should only be carried out when absolutely necessary, so killing a large group of people unnecessarily is even worse, Thor tried to explain. You assume that I accept that killing people is wrong, Loki said flatly. You don't? Thor asked, flabbergasted. Explain to me why it's wrong, Loki requested, ignoring the question. Well, Thor was floundering at having to explain such a basic concept. Would you like it if someone killed you? That's why we know that it's wrong to kill others. Those frost giants and pathetic humans could never kill me, Loki said disdainfully. And let's not pretend that your Avengers are typical human specimens. Thor sighed. I see we have a long way to go. As it happened, despite what he had just managed to convince Thor of, Loki did fully acknowledge that murder was a problem, and he was, as a general rule, against it. He just only viewed the deaths of Asgardians as murder. The Jotun were monsters and the humans were but ants. How could killing them possibly be wrong? It's never going to work, Loki said confidently. Thor, I won't stroke your ego and soothe your conscience by allowing you to redeem me. Thor eyed him sadly. This isn't about me, Loki. That would certainly be a change, wouldn't it? Loki asked flippantly. I'm going to prove you wrong, Thor vowed, a familiar fire burning in his eyes. Loki smiled coldly. You can try. Thor's mind was alive with possibilities as he left Loki's cell and made his way back to where his parents were waiting for him. Loki wasn't going to make this easy for him, but that was fine. Loki never made anything easy for anyone, especially since he'd found out about that adoption thing. But how to go about handling the redemption was entirely up to him, and so he needed to think carefully. Frigga rose when he entered the room. How did it go? I think it went very well, all things considering, Thor said honestly. Odin, as always, seemed to look right through him. How so? He seems determined to thwart me but has given me an invitation to try, Thor replied. I believe that he will go along with it, at least at first, if only to try to prove that I cannot succeed. Frigga practically wilted at the news. Why is he being so stubborn? His being redeemed is the only way he will ever be able to be happy. Loki does not always act according to his own best interests, Odin reminded her. Need I remind you his reaction to finding out that I did not support the annihilation of the frost giants? Yes, but surely this is different. He must know that we do not seek to punish him for his actions. You did make that clear to him, Thor? Frigga inquired. Thor nodded. I believe that might be part of the problem. He still thinks of me as the favored son who always gets everything he wants, and he does not wish to be another triumph of mine. I can see where that might be a problem, Frigga acknowledged. But there is no one who wants to save your brother more than you do. And no one who can better bring him in line again if it proves necessary, Odin added darkly. Thor nodded, reluctantly accepting that truth. He has never responded well to orders, so being told that he will redeem himself might not have produced the best reaction in him. What should we have done? Odin asked him. Lied to him. Even if we could craft a sufficient one to fool such a master of lies as he, it would not aid us in our quest to bring him back to us. I'll get through to him, father, I swear it, Thor vowed. It wasn't his fault, of course, that Loki had made some truly horrendous choices over the last year or so, but he couldn't help but feel responsible all the same. If only he hadn't insisted on rushing off to Jotunheim, then Loki never would have. Well, never was an awfully long time, especially for beings such as they. But Loki certainly wouldn't have found out about being a Jotun then. Perhaps their father would have broken the news to him more gently and he would have reacted better. Or perhaps if he had not been banished he could have somehow helped the situation. It didn't matter then, the frost giants had only entered the kingdom because of Loki's interference, and his brother had goaded him into charging off for Jotunheim. Though apparently only to convince their father that he was not fit to be king and they were not to actually reach their destination. It didn't matter that he might not have gone if Loki hadn't interfered again and riled him up. His actions, encouraged however they might have been, were still his own responsibility. But it was too late for might have beens, and he had to pour all of his energy into fixing the mistakes of the past now. I do hope you know, Thor, that, child of my flesh or not, I do love your brother dearly and I want him to succeed in this as much as you do, Odin said gravely. Thor nodded. Of course, father. Frigga smiled fondly at her husband. It's good to see how far you've come on this matter, Odin. Odin coughed and refused to look at her. Thor narrowed his eyes. Father? Odin looked uncomfortable. Now, this was a very long time ago. Loki would not react well to hearing about it, and, unlike the truth of his parentage, I doubt very much this is something he can stumble upon on his own. Mother? Thor asked. Frigga looked meaningfully at her husband. The only good part of a mistake is the chance to learn from it. Yes, Odin agreed. But Thor's reaction to the Loki situation makes it unlikely that he will. Oh, all right. I'll never forget the first thing that your father said to me when he brought Loki in to see me for the first time, Frigga said distantly. He didn't warn me in any way that he was bringing a baby frost giant to live with us. By the way, he just did it. I knew that my queen would rise to the challenge admirably, Odin claimed. Frigga smiled at that. Do you know why, exactly, your father decided to raise him at the palace? He would never have killed a child, of course, or left him to die when he was so clearly abandoned by his own people, but he could have made other arrangements. Thor frowned. Loki said something about how father wished to use him to unite our two kingdoms or something along those lines. And that was my initial goal, Odin insisted. Your initial secondary goal, Frigga corrected. The very first thing he said to me right before handing your baby brother to me was, what do you think will happen if we raise a frost giant in Asgard? Thor stared at her unblinking for a moment. What? Odin winced. Do you have to put it like that? That was how you put it, Frigga reminded him. So Loki came to be my brother because you wanted to run an experiment? Thor demanded, trying to make sense of it all. That sounded like the sort of thing that he would have done once, long ago. Or rather, about a year ago before he had been banished to Midgard. But that really did feel like a lifetime to him. It wasn't a malicious desire, to be sure, but Odin was right that Loki would not handle that news very well. I will admit that I was curious, Odin conceded. Nothing like this had ever been done before as far as I'm aware. I wanted to see if he could adjust to life on Asgard. I hoped he would, since he looked like an Asgardian himself. It was, as the humans say, a test of nature versus nurture. A frost giant will never belong in Asgard, but I thought that a baby who was born a frost giant might yet be raised to be an Asgardian. And it worked. For a very long time it worked, but then Loki discovered the truth and I was unable to stay awake for long enough to explain properly and he made some poor choices and here we are." "And it didn't bother you that he was using Loki as a test subject?" Thor asked his mother. Frigga shook her head. "Of course I wasn't pleased, but it was a natural curiosity and a short-lived one. I assure you. Within the year it was much less about objectively wanting to see if it could be done and more about desiring for it to happen. I had concluded that the experiment was a success centuries ago," Odin continued. "And then, well, now he's my son and so failure simply isn't an option. He was a frost giant once and now he's Asgardian and we have to make him see that." "You have to make him see that, Thor." Thor nodded. "I will not fail you, father." After he had finished his audience with his parents, Thor went to go find his friends and, unsurprisingly, found them in the banquet hall watching Volstagg consuming a great deal of food with the usual mixture of awe and disgust on their faces. "My friends," Thor greeted them merrily, walking into the room. "Thor, please tell me that the news about Loki is wrong," Sif pleaded. Thor frowned. "I shall do my best. What news is it?" "He's not going to be punished for his treasonous and genocidal actions at all?" Sif demanded. Thor relaxed. "Ah, you're right to worry. That's not true at all." "See," Fandral told her breezily. "I knew you were getting all worked up over nothing." "What is to be his punishment?" Hogun asked. "I'm going to take him down to Midgard and redeem him," Thor explained. "Midgard? Really?" Fandral asked, surprised. "After all that he did there? Even when he was king here and trying to destroy Jotunheim, he never truly acted against Asgard, but he's done a great deal of damage there. Have your Midgard friends agreed to this?" "Not yet," Thor admitted. "But they will. I'm going to go down and talk to them. My work with Loki can begin the day after that." Sif sighed. "Thor, I know you said that Loki would be punished and that was good, but then you followed that up by claiming that he would not be punished and that's not so good. Which is it?" "He's being punished," Thor assured her, uncertain as to the cause of the confusion. "Thor, redeeming someone isn't really a punishment," Volstagg said, looking up from his meal. "It is when the person being punished is Loki and the person doing the redeeming is me," Thor countered, hating the fact that this was true but knowing without a doubt that it was. "You must believe that this will work, Thor, and for what it's worth I hope that you're right," Sif told him. "But you have to consider the other side of this as well. What are you going to do if this doesn't work? What if you can't redeem Loki?" "I can and I will," Thor said with more confidence than he felt. He couldn't start doubting himself before he had even begun, not with so many other people doing all his doubting for him. That was usually the end of it, but this time Sif shook her head. "No, Thor, this is important. You already know what will happen if I'm wrong, but what if you are?" "I won't be," Thor insisted. "Then you'll never have to follow through with your plan, but you need to have one. You can't be completely certain that you'll succeed however much you might want to be," Sif argued. Thor stopped. "I don't know, Sif. I really don't. And how will I define failure anyway? I don't expect it to work immediately, but is there supposed to be some sort of time limit? Like he can be redeemed any day for a year, but the minute it's been a year then he's a lost cause? I don't want to give up too soon." "Trust me," Fandral told him wryly, "that is one criticism that can never be levied against you." Thor did grin at that, briefly, before sobering again. "He is my brother and I am not ready to give up on him. I don't know that I ever will be willing to." "What if he goes on another rampage?" Sif pressed. "What if you can't stop him? And even if you can, how many rampages will it take before enough is enough?" "Those are all excellent questions, Sif, and I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't. If it comes to that, and I pray that it won't, but if it comes to that, then I'll deal with it as appropriately as I can. I will redeem my brother, though, or die trying." "When you say, die, do you mean yourself dying or Loki dying?" Volstagg inquired curiously. Thor shrugged. "Either, both, it doesn't matter. Either way I'll have failed, but it won't come to that." "Let us hope you are right," Hogun spoke up. "I think we would lose you either way." Thor shook himself. "This wasn't what I wanted to discuss with you." "Oh, there's something even more pressing?" Fandral asked dryly. "Joy. Loki and I will not be spending all of our time on Midgard," Thor told them. "If only because I do not have any idea how long this could take and I do not want to commit to leaving Asgard for years on end." "I think we're talking more centuries on end," Sif said. Maybe decades if Loki has even the slightest spark of goodness still in him, and you're very, very lucky. He does, Thor assured them. I know he may not ever act like it, and he did stab me that one time I tried to get him to help me stop that army he unleashed, but he looked like he might regret his actions. Regret is all fine and good, Volstagg opined. But if he does it anyway, then it doesn't serve much of a practical purpose now, does it? Perhaps not, Thor conceded. But it's a start. If he's already regretting not being good again and the evil deeds that he commits against Asgardians, at least, then we have a good starting point. I suppose it could be worse, Sif agreed reluctantly. But what did you want to tell us, something about you not spending all of your time on Midgard? Thor nodded. Ah, right. I have a favor to ask of you, my friends, and I know very well that it is a big one. Know that I do not ask this lightly, and please do not question my sanity for requesting it. This sounds promising, Fandral remarked, his lips twitching upwards. He clapped his hands dramatically. Well, out with it. Thor took a deep breath. I would appreciate it, he said slowly, if when Loki and I are back here and around you four that you would try to treat him the way that you always did. If he was waiting for a terrible reaction to this idea, then he was not disappointed. What? Hogun cried out. Volstagg dropped the mutton chop he was in the middle of eating. Fandral looked like he might fall over, and Sif, it was almost as if steam were coming out of her ears. How can you even ask us something like that? She demanded. You want us to just pretend like none of this ever happened and continue to act as though he were our friend? I think that bridge was burnt when he sent a destroyer to murder us. Or possibly when we decided to commit treason against him to bring you back, Fandral amended. But a line was definitely crossed when he tried to kill us. So you did consider Loki to be a friend then? Thor asked, nodding to himself. Volstagg stared at him. Of course we did. Not as close a friend as we considered you, but a friend nonetheless. How can you even ask us that? He looked almost hurt. Those shook his head. My apologies, friends. Loki is so certain that you only ever tolerated him, and, though I never saw that, I had to consider the possibility. Now that I have done so, I am pleased to discover that this is yet another example of something that Loki is too cynical about. Loki's negativity aside, Thor, how are we supposed to just pretend like nothing has happened? Sif asked again. Too much has, and we can never go back. Well, maybe not go back, per se, Thor told her. Just do not treat him the way that you would treat a genocidal lunatic who has tried to kill us all, Fandral supplied helpfully. Thor nodded. Yes, that. And maybe it would help if you were not to mention that. Why? Hogun asked. Loki is already against the idea of being redeemed, Thor confided. And so I believe that he will gladly take any sign from anyone that they do not want him to be redeemed to indicate that he is too hated to ever be allowed to come back, despite what we have assured him, and will only make my job that much harder. Wait, Loki does not even want to be redeemed? Sif couldn't believe it. Then why are you doing it? Sometimes people don't always know what's best for them, Thor explained. And when they have started to make the life choices that Loki has made, you can be reasonably sure that they fall into this category. Yes, but still, Sif started to say. Think of it this way, Thor interrupted. If you let your enmity show and Loki uses this as an excuse not to change, then you're just letting Loki win. And is that really what you want? The four of them were silent for a long moment. Finally, Volstagg started chuckling. You have some skewed logic, Thor, but I find that I cannot argue with you. Nor can I, Hogun said quietly. I'm sure I could, but you'll just win in the end anyway, so why bother? Fandral asked rhetorically. Sif glared at the warriors three. Well, I can argue, but I seem to have been deserted and I do not wish to argue this alone. Fine, Thor, we'll play nice with Loki. Thor beamed at them. That's all I ask. Sif shook her head. All I ask, indeed. Besides, while nothing will ever excuse what Loki did, I think you'll find that his actions are quite understandable. Terribly wrong-headed, of course, and would have had disastrous consequences, but you can really see where he was coming from, Thor continued thoughtfully. What's this? Fandral asked, puzzled. In what way was Loki deciding to kill us to keep you banished? Lying to you about Odin's death, firing and attempting to murder Heimdall, letting Loki into Odin's bedchamber as he lay helpless before killing him, and then randomly attempting to destroy Jotunheim, understandable. To make no mention of what he did, added. His attempted murder of you, his own brother, I take a special offense to. What about his attempted murder of us? Fandral asked, surprised. Volstagg shrugged. If he didn't think we saw him as friends, then that's less terrible than his repeatedly trying to kill Thor, who he's never had reason to doubt was his brother. Oh, if only they knew, but they weren't going to know. Not until Loki wanted them to. And, while he had a great deal of faith in his friends, a part of him couldn't help but wonder how they would react to the news that Loki was born a frost giant himself. I am sworn to secrecy about Loki's motivations, but, rest assured, his actions were not as haphazard as they first appear, Thor promised. I think that might just make it worse, Sif said slowly, if he really had a reason to do what he did. It will go no further, Thor said again. I will take care of it. I recommend that we call for some ale, Volstagg told him, because from what you've told us, you're definitely going to need it. Tony poured himself another drink. It's strange. I don't feel nearly drunk enough to be hallucinating. Thor frowned. You believe yourself to be drunk enough to hallucinate and yet you continue drinking? Hallucinations are much less worrying after you've gotten a sufficient amount of alcohol in you, Tony confided. And, note to self, if I'm going to have a hallucination that sounds like Pepper, I would prefer for it to look like her as well. I'm not a hallucination, Thor insisted. Are you sure? Tony asked, peering at him skeptically. Thor laughed. Fairly, yes. Well, I guess you haven't touched the scotch, Tony conceded. Why would you think that you were hallucinating? Thor asked, concerned. Does that sort of thing happen to you a lot? Tony rolled his eyes. You're sounding like Pepper again. And after what I heard, I was hoping that I was hallucinating and, let me tell you, that doesn't happen a lot. You hallucinating or you hoping that you're hallucinating? Thor asked. Tony's eyes had yet to come down from examining the ceiling. What did I say that was so very strange? Thor wondered, puzzled. Tony chuckled. You should know, you're the one who said it. Thor continued to stare at him. You want your brother, better known as the megalomaniac who we finally packed off to your flying little organ city after he tried to conquer the world and killed Coulson, to come back to Earth and do good deeds, until he agrees to stop being evil, Tony said flatly. Thor nodded. I know. I just told you that, and you don't see the problem with this? Tony demanded. I'm confident that you will enlighten me, Thor replied. The last time your brother came to Earth, he killed dozens of people personally and caused the deaths of thousands of others with that army he summoned, Tony told him. It took everything the six of us had and a damn nuke to stop him. And you want to risk that again? When all of this was only a few weeks ago? When we only got rid of him yesterday? We're not nearly done with repairs yet and you really don't want to know the kinds of estimates we're looking at. Loki won't do that again, Thor promised. Tony crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. Oh, he's redeemed already, is he? That's wonderful news. What do you need to send him here for then? Tony, Thor started to say. Or wait, I know, you've decided that just because Loki promised, if he even promised, that he would not lead another Chitauri army against Earth, that means that not only will he keep that promise but that he's been rendered utterly harmless, Tony exclaimed. I can handle him, Thor told him firmly, ignoring the jibe. Like you handled him the last time he was here? Tony asked rhetorically. I've been thinking about that and I've come to a solution, Thor informed him. Do tell, Tony said, slightly mockingly. It won't be easy for Loki to leave the planet, and as long as we're on the same planet, I've never had difficulty locating him, Thor replied. Oh, well, if you know where he is then he couldn't possibly cause any trouble, Tony said sarcastically. Did you know, Thor said slowly, seeming to change the subject, that even the Hulk could not lift my Mjolnir? Tony blinked. No, I hadn't heard. Do you want a medal or something? Seriously, I've been contacted about medal specifications for we Avengers for our heroics, so it would be the easiest thing in the world to get you an extra one for your ability to pick up something the Hulk can't even pick up. I know I'm giving myself an extra medal for flying a nuke into space and single-handedly saving the day. That's not quite the way I remember it, Thor told him, frowning. Then you really should have been a part of the medal committee, Tony replied. And besides, it's totally true. Sure, Agent Romanoff stabbed something and saved us from the nuke's explosion, but my explosion was what stopped the invasion, so, if you think about it, I win. I have no desire to, and Thor said, wondering if he were really serious. Good, because you didn't, Tony said matter-of-factly. Thor shook his head and tried to get back on track. Wielding the Mjolnir has nothing to do with strength. There is an enchantment on it that says that only the worthy can lift it. Okay, you are so angling for an extra medal, Tony decided. You may claim otherwise, but I've got experience with you so-called modest types. I have never been called modest in my life, Thor said flatly. He paused. Except once by Loki, but I'm nearly positive that he did not mean that. Probably a good guess, Tony agreed. Well, if you want to show off, then that's your business. Just word of advice, don't say that around Bruce. I'm not showing off, Thor protested. I'm just stating a fact. Tony rolled his eyes. Right, like I'm not showing off when I tell people that I'm a genius billionaire playboy philanthropist superhero, or when I go into a building and let everyone know that I could buy it and it wouldn't make a dent in any of my dozens of bank accounts. I'm really not, Thor repeated. I am the only one who has tried to wield Mjolnir in living memory who has succeeded. Loki cannot lift it. If you regularly point this out to him, I'm going to start understanding where he gets his issues from, Tony remarked. Thor narrowed his eyes. You're intentionally being difficult. Me? Tony asked, smirking. Never. In the past, when Loki was attacking me and I needed to do something else, I was able to immobilize him by pinning him under Mjolnir, Thor revealed. If things get out of hand, then I can do it again. Tony stared at him. That's a damn good plan, he admitted. And you said that you've done it before, so you didn't just think of it now. Is there some reason you didn't do this the last time he was here? Thor looked down at the ground. This was more than a year ago, and on a day I prefer not to think about. It honestly did not occur to me when we were facing Loki recently. Well, you'd better not forget again, Tony told him. I'm sure you'll remind me if I do, Thor said calmly. Besides, I really do not believe that Mjolnir will even be necessary. Tony barked out a laugh. I would love to know how you came to that conclusion, Thor. I mean, I know he's your brother and all, but sooner or later you're going to have to acknowledge that he's kind of evil. Once I accepted the truth about my old family friend, my life had a lot fewer attempts on it. I do know my brother, Thor agreed, bowing his head, and, what's more, I know his vulnerabilities. Tony righted. Oh, do tell. I want details. He has an ego, Thor said simply. And an insecurity complex for that matter, which was infinitely more complicated than just one or the other. Tony got it almost immediately. Thor nodded. Yes. He'll stay, at least for a while, if only to prove me wrong. Tony shook his head. Egos. Jarvis, make a note to remind me to never get one. The next morning, Thor was stopped by his mother on his way to breakfast and then Loki's room. How are you feeling, Thor? She asked gently. The lie on his lips died at the sight of his mother's concern. I don't know, he said honestly. Nervous. What if this doesn't work? Then we'll keep trying, Frigga said simply. There's nothing else we can do. Thor nodded. But what about any damage that he causes while he's refusing to be redeemed? We'll make up for that as best we can and try to make sure it doesn't happen again, Frigga replied. I know that, realistically, it is unlikely for Loki to refuse to let us help him forever, Thor said slowly. But, just the same, if anyone is capable of being that stubborn, it's Loki. And even should he eventually come around, it could take centuries. We shall have to ensure that he does not wish to be that stubborn, Frigga told him. It is not so bad to be completely forgiven your crimes and to be offered a condition-less second chance. That's what worries me, Thor admitted. I would not be terribly surprised if Loki refuses to cooperate merely to spite Mir and cupped Thor's face gently. Listen well, Thor. If your brother does this, then it will not be your fault. As much as we try to help him, he will ultimately have to make his own decisions. I know that, no matter what else happens, you will have done your best to save him. Yes, Thor would try his best. He always tried his best. But what kind of a consolation was it when his best wasn't always good enough? What if Loki could be redeemed someday, but wasn't because Thor's best just wasn't able to reach him and he said or did the wrong thing? That kind of responsibility was terrifying, but he had never walked away from what he felt to be his duty before, and he wasn't about to start now. Besides, if he wasn't the one to help Loki, then who would? No one cared about Loki as much as their family did. Odin was too busy to be able to properly devote the time necessary to really help Loki, as much as he wanted to, and as for Frigga, she hardly needed to be protected, of course, but just the same Thor did not want to expose her to all the poisonous things Loki could and probably would say while he was resisting them. And his parents had faith in him. Maybe that would be enough. It was certainly something. Thor closed his eyes and Frigga stepped back. That kind of faith in me is exactly what Loki was complaining about. We might have faith that you will do your best and that no one has a better chance of succeeding than you do. Frigga allowed. And we will not start rejecting you in order to make your brother feel better. But I would argue that we have even more faith in Loki in order to give him this chance. A smile was fighting its way to Thor's face, and the blatant nepotism. Frigga nodded. But of course. We make enough sacrifices as the ruling family of Asgard, even though others may not see it. I will not sacrifice my son as well. Nor I my brother, Thor agreed. He looked at her seriously. Speak truthfully, mother. Do you believe that I can do this? Frigga kissed his cheek. Yes. Loki had not touched his breakfast when Thor finished his and went to collect his brother for the first step on his, hopefully short, path to redemption. Were you not hungry, brother? Thor asked, concerned. Are you feeling all right? Loki blinked lazily at him. I have never cared for scrambled eggs. Thor shook his head and didn't bother trying to hide his grin. What? Loki demanded, instantly annoyed at the very thought that Thor might be amused at his expense. Do you even hear yourself, brother? Thor asked, chuckling. You do not like your food and therefore you will not eat it? You are lucky indeed that this is the sentence we have arranged for you. Loki narrowed his eyes. It is not my concern if you do not know how to hold somebody prisoner, but I would be remiss indeed if I did not take advantage of your sentiment. The last word came out in a hiss. Why do you despise sentiment so? Thor wondered. It has certainly not harmed you any. It leads to people doing weak and foolish things and I disapprove of acting in such a manner in general, Loki replied darkly. And also, possibly, because you'd find it easier to insist that you are doomed to be evil forever and to be rejected by everyone if we weren't so eager for you to come back and be redeemed, Thor suggested. Loki shot him a venomous look. I don't recall saying anything about being doomed. I was paraphrasing, Thor replied. Then you should take care to be more accurate, Loki countered. Otherwise one might think that you completely missed the meaning. You would be much happier if you just gave in and let yourself be redeemed, Thor told him frankly. Loki shook his head and smirked darkly. I would have thought that by now, dear brother, you would have realized that I do not give in. You do not have the right to dictate what will or will not make me happy, either. I am not trying to dictate anything, Thor exclaimed earnestly. It's just that being evil does not seem to be working out for you and you seemed upset about your fall from Asgard. I do not imagine that you enjoy being in this cell, either. Being forgiven and taken back into the fold would be a clear improvement, so why would you not be happier? I dislike pity, Loki bit out. Thor rolled his eyes. It's not pity, Loki. We love you and we want to just put this whole dark saga behind us. I see how it is, Loki said, though Thor doubted very much that he did. You want to just forget about all of the turmoil you have caused and force me to live a lie as if I had never learned any of the truths I discovered. Thor sighed. You're free to make a public announcement on these truths of yours anytime you wish. Loki said nothing. He never would. Shall we go? Thor inquired at last. Wordlessly, held out his arms, Thor blinked. Okay. Aren't you going to bind me? Loki asked. I was not planning on it, no, Thor replied. Well, what about suppressing my magic? Loki asked. You could talk to father about that if you really wanted to, Thor offered. Loki rolled his eyes. I do not want to. I just cannot understand why you are not taking these basic precautions. Or why Loki was warning him, for that matter. You can hardly expect to redeem yourself if we do not trust you, Thor said reasonably. And your redemption will likely involve both the use of your hands and your magic. You had me bound and gagged on the way back to Asgard, Loki pointed out. That was for your own protection, Thor informed him. You would not stop provoking us and Clint's hands kept twitching for his arrows, so I did not want to take that risk. Besides, since I was taking you and the Tesseract back home with me with no regard for what they might have wanted to do, it seemed the least I could do to agree to their primitive bindings. How very generous of you, Loki said sarcastically. Thor laughed. I do my best. He turned and left the cell. Loki frowned but followed him. Where are we going? He asked casually. Thor knew better. If there was one thing Loki could not stand, there were actually several. Then it was not knowing something. This lack of knowledge about their destination was burning him. Fortunately for Loki, while in the past Thor might have withheld such knowledge just to tease him, he decided that the best way to help Loki was to be a little kinder. "We are going back to Midgard," Thor revealed. Loki stopped. "We're what?" Dutifully, Thor repeated, "We're going back to Midgard. We're going back to the place where I recently tried to conquer, and I'm not to be in any way incapacitated." Loki couldn't believe it. Thor nodded. "You'll be able to properly meet my new friends this time." Loki closed his eyes and looked almost as if he were in pain. "Thor, please tell me that you are not taking me to the Avengers Tower." "I could tell you that if you'd like," Thor volunteered. "It would be a falsehood, however." "What would you even have me do there?" Loki asked him. Thor shrugged. "There is a lot to rebuild after the battle. I'm sure we will find something for you to do. And cleaning up your own mess can only help make real this tragedy to you. It was always real to me, if not a tragedy. And you know that everyone there hates me," Loki said flatly. "You have done much to make up for," Thor acknowledged gravely. "Do you really think that any of them will let me make up for it?" Loki demanded. Thor stated to answer, then stopped and began smiling again. Loki eyed him warily. "What? That sounds like an admission that you might want to be redeemed," Thor said brightly. Loki immediately began protesting profusely, but Thor wasn't listening. Loki was never going to make this easy, but perhaps they could do it after all. The Bifrost was now being repaired, and Loki was kind of glad that Thor wasn't going to have made such a permanent change to Asgard for all that he would one day be king. But not enough time had passed since Thor had retrieved the Tesseract to even begin to make the Bifrost passable again. Instead, they had been sent directly the Tesseract, and when the time came they would call for Heimdall and be taken back the same way. Not that he knew how long he would be staying. Thor hadn't thought to mention it on his own, and Loki was loath to reveal a vulnerability by asking himself. "This does not look like the Avenger Tower," Loki remarked as he looked around. It was a little obvious, to be sure, but it still had to be said. "We will go there soon, brother," Thor assured him. "But first, let's go in here." He pointed towards a small store that said 7-Eleven, and, reluctantly, Loki followed him in. He did not want to go in, but he was even more unwilling to wait outside with the humans by himself and trust that Thor wouldn't get distracted by all the glorious Midgardian wonders. 7-Eleven seemed to sell a lot of food, most of which he had never seen before. Thor headed straight for a shelf towards the back of the store that contained blue boxes labeled Pop-Tarts. "What flavor would you like?" Thor asked him politely. "What is a Pop-Tart?" Loki countered. Thor's eyes lit up. "A Pop-Tart is only one of the most delicious breakfast foods that I have ever tried. They come in a wide variety of flavors and are conveniently packaged so that you can eat them even when not at a proper table." "I don't want one," Loki told him. "But you didn't touch your scrambled eggs," Thor protested. Loki rolled his eyes. "I'm not a child, Thor. If I don't want to eat breakfast, then I don't have to. Also, I'm a prisoner, so you can stop worrying about my eating habits." "You would think that being a prisoner means that we could force you to eat breakfast," Thor countered. That was a good point, and so Loki chose to ignore it. "Why don't you eat these Pop-Tarts if you really want them?" "I am not hungry right now, I just had a satisfactory breakfast," Thor replied. "But that is a good idea, so I shall get some for later. Are you sure you do not have a flavor preference?" "I'm sure," Loki said firmly. "Then I will simply have to get a box of every kind available," Thor informed him, taking a box of each of the 6 flavors and slowly walking up towards the cashier. The boxes couldn't have been heavy, but Thor did look a little awkward holding them all. Loki could have offered to help. He didn't. When he and Thor arrived on one of the higher floors of the damaged Stark Tower, after Thor had pestered him into eating a blueberry Pop-Tart that he refused to admit to liking, they faced a crowded room. Loki did not know many humans, but he did recognize all of these people. There was the man whose home T-Hay were currently occupying, of course, Tony Stark. He had an impressive amount of sheer audacity, especially considering that Stark was by all accounts a genius and he had seen Loki in action before. When he faced Loki down completely alone and unarmed. When he was just a regular human without the armor, in Stark Tower, he had known exactly what he was doing. The stupidity of the action was only increased by the lack of stupidity of the man. Yes, Stark had ultimately survived, but it was a close thing, even considering that Loki had not killed him directly but had thrown him off of the building. Self-destructive? Perhaps? It would line up with his past far better than sentiment and would be heroics, and it would be nice to think that there were a few rational people out there. Even taking that missile to the Chitauri wasn't selfless, as Stark would have died had he done nothing. S.H.I.E.L.D. director Nick Fury was there as well. Was he never going to escape one-eyed authority figures trying to thwart him? Though the fact that he had managed to fool and frustrate someone that made him think of both Heimdall and Odin was certainly an unexpectedly pleasant part of his stay on the S.H.I.E.L.D. airship. The both of them were notoriously difficult to get one over on. Heimdall, in fact, proved highly resistant to the world-destroying casket of ancient winter. Still, his presence could only be a negative given the amount of damage that Loki had done to S.H.I.E.L.D. forces. Steve Rogers. Just his Captain America moniker would be enough to alert Loki to something being amiss about him, even without the whole sordid tale of the man out of time. Being yanked away from everything he's ever known and trusted and being thrust into a terrifying new world through no fault of his own. Loki might have identified, and Rogers' story definitely had potential. Unfortunately, he was so dreadfully boring. A stand-up guy loyal to the cause and accepting of everybody? What was he supposed to do with that? It was some of Thor's most irritating qualities, only greatly magnified. Loki had enjoyed dominating him in that fight in Germany the way he'd never been able to dominate Thor. It had actually been a shame his plan required him to surrender when Stark showed up, bringing his own fight music. That was style. Bruce Banner. After his rampage had nearly brought the airship down, it was a little surprising to see him still uncaged. There was a cage to be found, undoubtedly, but there he was walking around a free man anyway. But then, it had not been terribly long since the New York battle, and the Hulk had, mostly, managed to face the right direction then. That gratitude would fade and Banner would once more be forced to face the truth about himself. He was just as much of a monster as Loki, regardless of what those around them might like to pretend sometimes. He might as well just let the galaxy know that he was a frost giant. But then, if he was a monster, then people would see it through his actions, and he need hardly condescend to let them know why. Agent Barton. That man who had been his most faithful and among the most useful of his puppets was somehow managing to look at him with more hostility than everyone else combined. It was so like a human to take something that really had nothing to do with him and make it personal. He was probably blaming himself for what he had done. If he'd been an Asgardian, his mind never would have been stolen, and he'd even failed to kill Natasha Romanoff as he had been sent to do. Weak. Despite that, he could and probably would make things more difficult than they needed to be. But then, nothing about Thor's whole delusional redemption scenario was at all necessary, so what was one more needless element thrown into the mix? He could only hope that this wouldn't be boring, but his expectations were not high. It was Midgard, after all. Why had he ever wanted to rule it again? Right. Thor? Was there nothing that was not about that man? Agent Romanoff. Loki's personal least favorite. It wasn't, as these humans seemed to think, because she was a woman. Sif was a woman and, while she was as annoying as any of his brother's friends, he well respected her skill in battle and knew that without his magic he wouldn't have a prayer against her. And it wasn't that she had tricked him, either, because that had been annoying but ultimately useless. No, he hated her because she lived a lie, the same lie that Thor was trying to shove down his throat. Redemption. The idea that no matter what you had done, you could always make up for it by championing the side of good. If there even was such a thing. S.H.I.E.L.D. had its share of dark secrets, and the island of Manhattan had almost been obliterated by one of their birds. It would have been another interesting test of Asgardian immortality had he not been there himself. Thor had cheated anyway with that falling death trap. Those who believed that they could change their fate, often written long before they were aware of it, disgusted him. "Hello, friends," Thor boomed, effortlessly cutting through the awkward silence. "Thor, you said that Asgard would imprison him," Fury said, a little annoyed. Thor nodded. "Well, he doesn't look very imprisoned to me," Fury said, nodding Loki's way. Loki merely gazed coolly at him. "What kind of Asgardian justice is this?" Fury demanded. "We were not going to kill Loki," Thor replied. "He is my brother." Loki was not, but he was not about to have this argument again in front of people he did not particularly care to know about his origins. So that left us with two options. Imprisoning someone forever is a little excessive no matter what they have done, so we could either imprison him for a very long time and hope that he would not be even more evil at the end of it. Which is usually what happens. Or we could try and prevent future outbreaks of evil deeds by redeeming him, Thor explained. We chose the latter. That does make a certain sort of sense, Rogers said slowly. But only when someone desires redemption for themselves. Does Loki? Thor wouldn't look at him. He's here, isn't he? Fury just shook his head. I hope you know what you're doing. Stark's convinced me to allow this for now, but the council cannot hear about this. You would lie to your own leaders? Thor asked, shocked. Stark snorted. Lying to the council is official SHIELD policy. It's true, Banner added. Apparently they've been looking for me for a year, and yet SHIELD sent Natasha off to me the minute the Tesseract was stolen. I do not mean to pry, but why is everyone here? Thor wondered. Is something going on that I am not aware of? No, Barton assured him. We were just curious to see how this little drama would play out. With Loki, Thor realized. Tony, you said that you would have suggestions for how we should get started, I believe. I do, Stark said, nodding. We all helped, Romanoff said, smiling downright wickedly. But before we get to that, Stark said, seemingly casual, if you're going to be spending some time down here you're going to need money, right? You had to have had some to buy those Pop-Tarts you have with you, but how much can you possibly have? None, Thor admitted. I was recognized as having fought in the battle against the Chitauri and was given these for free. Free stuff is always good, Stark agreed. But you cannot rely on it. How would you like it if whatever you wanted to buy was paid for by me? Chances are, I can get a tax break for it anyway. Thor looked delighted. That would be wonderful. Loki was reluctant to break his silence in front of all these people who hated him, but he really did have to say something at this point. He's going to want something in return more substantial than a tax break, whatever that was. Barton and Romanoff both glared at him, not so much for what he had said but the fact that he had spoken at all. Stark grinned a little, unconcerned. Well, what do you know about merchandising? Absolutely nothing, Thor said honestly. It's where you sell products related to a person or character. Well, I've licensed everyone else. And by that I mean, the Hulk, Captain America, and myself. And so I would like to have your permission to start selling Thor merchandise. Why would anyone want something with my name or image upon it? Thor asked, confused. Stark shrugged. I don't know, but they will. Believe me, they will. I'm already making a ton of money on what I've sold so far. I mean, I had already been selling Iron Man merchandise and even sales for that are up. You don't need all this money anyway, and dealing with all the logistics and little details will just give you a headache. Let me do this and I'll take care of all of the financials. Just sign here. He held up a contract. Thor took the contract and Loki moved so that he could read it, because he knew that Thor wouldn't, and, after Loki nodded, Thor signed his name. It's a little disturbing that you just happened to have that on hand, Roger said, shaking his head. Is this about my persistence in getting you to sign? Stark asked, amused. I'd call it more harassment, Rogers grumbled. He looked at the rest of them. He followed me to the gym and yammered on about the benefits of doing this for 3 hours. I went through twice as many punching bags as usual. So, Loki, any chance of you? Stark stopped abruptly at the look that Loki was giving him. I'll take that as a no, then. I have signed, Thor said, handing the contract back. Now what is your idea? From the way that certain members of the group were smirking at him, Loki had a feeling that he probably did not want to know. This, Loki sniffed, looking at all the trash dotting the side of the road, is beneath me. I know that it may not be the most glamorous of tasks, brother, but it must be done, Thor told him. He turned to Banner. I had not been aware that cleaning up highways was a part of our Avenger initiative, however. It wasn't, Banner agreed, but they decided to try something new and expand. They decided to do this the minute that they heard your plan, Loki translated. I'm sure that's not it, Thor disagreed. Loki sighed. Am I supposed to just pick up the trash with my bare hands, or am I allowed to use magic? Thor looked surprised at the question. If you weren't going to be allowed to use magic, then there would not be much point in ignoring your complaints and letting you keep your magic. Loki waved his hand and all of the trash within view began to float towards the bag they had brought. Wait, Banner said, frowning. Are you saying that Loki doesn't think you're being hard enough on him? The last thing that Loki wanted was to discuss his various issues with Thor's special brand of punitive measures with an outsider, and so, as the three began to walk towards more trash, he said, Does it bother you that you have a cage at Stark Tower? Banner blinked at him. How did you even? He hadn't known, of course, but it was obvious that he would. Thor groaned. Loki, what? Loki asked. I'm honestly curious. And still very much thinking about what had happened the last time he had seen the monster lurking within this seemingly dull scientist. That cage is for everybody's protection in case the other guy gets out of control. It's a precaution and nothing else, Banner said clearly. I suppose, Loki said slowly. But then, you're hardly the only one who's dangerous and yet you're the only one not trusted, aren't you? Anyone else can plan to have a real fight in the middle of a crisis and no one so much as bats an eye, but when it's Dr. Banner then he can't display the slightest emotion or else hands start twitching for guns. Thor sighed. You always do this. I'm so sorry, Bruce. Don't worry about it, Banner assured him. He narrowed his eyes at Loki. I rarely show signs of being angry. If people were to freak out every time one of the others got upset, then they would almost never calm down. Or it could be the fact that they can get angry without destroying everything in sight, Loki theorized. Banner smiled wanly. Believe me, getting angry is not the secret. Still, just knowing that there is a special place to cage you and no one else, Loki trailed off. I think you well proved that my various cages can adequately house others if need be, Banner replied. And yes, for your information, the others do occasionally use it. Loki raised an eyebrow. Oh, Tony, Banner revealed, uses it whenever he wants to practice his fighting but is too busy to take it outside. And this happens often? Thor asked him uncertainly. Banner smiled again. Let's just say that if the other guy does come out and needs to be contained then he might have to wait a while. They could have flown back to the Avenger Tower. Thor certainly wanted to, but Loki and Steve put their foot down and insisted on driving. Perhaps it was understandable that Steve did not wish to abandon his vehicle or allow Thor to carry it. He had carried far heavier, but the sight of a car being lifted in the air, however carefully, seemed to distress people. Of course, Thor had wanted to fly directly to the highway instead of having to drive and park a distance away. Though they did not have to pay as Tony owned parking all over the city, but, again, his companions refused. Perhaps Steve felt being carried would be uncomfortable and Loki was likely just being difficult. He wondered if Loki had perfected that flying spell he had been attempting before the failed coronation. Once they finally got back to the tower, Thor decided to break the silence. Silence was better than provocations or arguments but was still very boring. You have been doing marvelous work, Loki, he praised. These highways are getting markedly cleaner. Soon you shall have cleaned up every stretch of highway in the area. It will be a proud day to be sure, Loki said sarcastically. Thor was sure that he would be pleased when he was finished, though, if only because he could do something else. Watching Loki spending hours cleaning up trash was rather dull, and so he was glad that another Avenger usually accompanied them. Granted, they weren't there to provide entertainment, but it was a satisfactory side effect. Yes, Steve agreed, though he looked suspicious. I have never seen these highways so clean, ever. And you, of course, have many years of experience observing the cleanliness of highways, Loki replied. Steve's face darkened at that. I've seen enough. I've been by some of the stretches you've already cleaned and they're still clean. I could be wrong, Loki said in a tone that made it clear that he wasn't, but wouldn't that be a good thing? Or am I out here solely for your amusement? Others certainly were amused, but it was still a good thing that Loki was doing. It wasn't saving anyone directly, but a good environment was good for the people and he had to start small. I must agree that I do not see the problem, Thor spoke up. It's unnatural, Steve tried to explain as pushed the button for the elevator. The elevator had apparently been resting on the first floor, for the doors opened up right away and they stepped onto it. Thor frowned. Take care how you speak. I would argue that we all could be considered unnatural here on Midgard. Or anywhere in some cases, Loki murmured, eyeing Steve. That wasn't what I meant, Steve said, shaking his head. All of that trash piles up on the highway some way, right? People throw trash out of their cars all the time. And other people have cleaned the highways before, but it has only been a temporary measure and soon the trash has piled up again. Thor blinked. Am I correct in understanding that you are annoyed because my brother is too good at helping people? That is what it sounds like, Loki agreed. It is tragic but perhaps not surprising given human nature. Steve glared at him. Do not even start with me about human nature. It is a depressing topic, yes, Loki told him pityingly. Steve shot Loki one last, disgusted look before turning back to Thor. He's clearly using magic. Thor frowned at him. Yes, he is. I thought you realized that when he had all the trash levitate and fly into the trash bag. No, I knew about that, Steve confirmed. But he has to be using magic to keep people from littering again. He just has to be. I'm afraid that I must echo my brother in asking why this is a problem, Thor told him. He's using magic on people, Steve explained. It would seem more reasonable to do it on the highway itself, Thor disagreed. And it's harmless at worst and might actually be beneficial. There is nothing harmless about your brother, Steve insisted. Be reasonable, Steve, Thor requested. If we cannot trust Loki to clean up trash, then what can we trust him to do? That, Steve said triumphantly as the elevator stopped and the doors opened, is exactly my point. But Thor was no longer listening as Jane Foster was waiting on the other side of the door. Oh, thank God, she exclaimed, laughing. I've been running over to the elevator every time someone showed up all day. I think I was kind of coming off as a crazy person. Just a little, Tony agreed from out of Thor's line of sight. But it was amusing. Why else do you think I kept having people come over? The traffic isn't usually this heavy. Jane's eye twitched. Tony, trust me, if it hadn't been happening to you, you would have found it as funny as we all did, Tony assured her. But it was happening to me, Jane exclaimed. Not my problem, Tony replied. Thor stepped forward. Jane Foster. Jane abruptly lost interest in her discussion with Tony. She smiled up at him. I love the way you always say my full name. Does this touching reunion really have to take place in the middle of the hall? Loki asked, annoyed. Normally I would say, yes, just to spite you, but in this case I think that the two lovebirds would probably appreciate some privacy as well. Jarvis, show them the path to Thor's room, Tony instructed. Thor blinked. My room? The ceiling was suddenly alight with red dots leading the pair to the room Tony was sending them to. Jane took a deep breath and then grabbed Thor's hand, and together they followed the path. When they reached their destination, Thor opened the door, very gently. Everything in Midgard was so fragile, and gestured for Jane to go in ahead of him. So this is your room? Jane said, looking around. Nice. Thor glanced around himself. I suppose so, although this is the first I've seen of it. I thought you had been doing this with Loki for a few days now, Jane said, biting her lip. Thor nodded. That is true, but we have been returning to Asgard every night. I have not yet had occasion to come in here. Still, it's nice to have somewhere that you can go if you need to, Jane persisted. Thor nodded. Yes, it is. I shall have to thank Tony later. I am not entirely familiar with all of these devices, but I can ask about those as well. Jane laughed and shook her head. Only Tony would think to get you all these electronics when you didn't even know that this room existed. So you recognize them? Thor asked hopefully. Jane nodded. I don't think you can be on this planet. Or at least in some parts of it, I guess. Without knowing what these are. So you'll teach me, then? Thor continued. Jane nodded. Oh, yes, I think we can have a lot of fun with these. They fell into silence then. Thor just could not stop staring at her. It had not been so very long since they had last met, only a little over a year ago, and yet it had felt like it was easily 10 times that length. Plus, as a mortal, time meant more to Jane than it ever could to him. And he found himself strangely unable to stop smiling. Jane didn't seem to mind, though, and if anything she looked to be having the same problem. I never thought I'd see you again, she breathed at last. Thor stared earnestly into her eyes. I promised you that I would return for you, Jane Foster. Did you doubt me? Jane shook her head. No, never, I mean. I had done my share of doubting you during our 3 days together, more than my share, actually. And then, no matter how crazy it all seemed, you proved to be right about everything, and so I don't think I'll ever doubt you again. But you thought that I wouldn't come back, Thor reminded her. Jane looked down. Yes. Maybe. I don't know. You had to understand that we had no idea what was going on. There was all this activity in the sky, and then it was all gone and you didn't come back. A whole year passed and you didn't come back. I knew that you wouldn't have promised me that you would return if you hadn't fully intended to keep that promise, but that just made it worse, somehow. Thor's brow furrowed. Worse? You said yet you didn't, Jane said simply. So something must have held you up. I didn't know if you were even alive or dealt with Loki or anything until last month when all of a sudden you and the others were on the news." Thor's stomach dropped. He had been afraid of what Jane would think when he did not return because she couldn't have known that he had been forced to destroy the Bifrost, but he hadn't expected her to worry about his life. That was the one thing that he almost never worried about. But then, she had been there when he had nearly been killed by Loki's destroyer, and mortals were so very fragile, so perhaps her worry was understandable. "I am so sorry, Jane," Thor apologized. Jane forced a smile. "Don't. It's not your fault. I'm sure of it, and I'm just glad that you're all right." "But it was my fault," Thor argued, "at least in part." Jane tilted her head. "What happened?" "My brother had an issue without another realm called Jotunheim," Thor said slowly, trying to figure out the best way to phrase this. "That was actually the realm that I was banished for going to, you know." "You never told me about your banishment," Jane prompted. "Not the details, anyway." "A long time ago, the people of Jotunheim, called Jotun or Frost Giants, invaded and ravaged planets with their casket of ancient winters that allowed them to turn everything to ice. It's also an incredible source of power. My people fought and ultimately defeated them and took the casket to ensure that such a thing could never happen again," Thor told her. "This was before my time, though." "I see," Jane said, nodding. "We have this mutual hatred between our two peoples. The peace is very fragile and we stay out of the other's realm," Thor continued. "But you went there," Jane pointed out. Thor nodded. "It was a mistake and I was angry. I was to be crowned king of Asgard as my father was stepping down. During the coronation, however, Frost Giants somehow broke into the palace and nearly stole the casket back before they were killed. I was furious and no one had any idea what had happened. My father said that it was an isolated act not worth jeopardizing the peace over and that the intruders had paid with their lives. I felt differently." "So you went to the Frost Giant world too, what?" Jane asked. "Teach them a lesson or something?" "That was exactly it," Thor agreed. "Unfortunately, I did not really think that through. I brought my 4 closest friends and Loki with me and they had dozens if not hundreds of soldiers ready to meet us in battle. If my father hadn't come, we likely all would have been dead. I did not see it that way at the time and was only annoyed that I had been pulled back. My actions nearly caused a renewal of the war with the Jotunheim and so my father cast me out." "I'm sorry, Thor," Jane said, taking his hand and squeezing it gently. "I'm not," Thor told her. "I was at the time but I recognize now that I needed that to see what a fool I was back then, a dangerous fool. And if that had not happened then we would not have met." A smile was tugging at Jane's lips. "There is that. Unfortunately, my father has these periods where he slips into what we call the Odin sleep," Thor told her. "My father is the most powerful being in all the 9 realms but he is also very old and occasionally must recharge his power. We never know how long it will last and he had been putting it off so that he could make me king first. Obviously, that did not happen and he went into the Odin sleep while things with Jotunheim were still unsettled. That left Loki the throne and the solemn task of saving Asgard from my actions." Jane winced. "I guess that did not go well. I do not know all the details but I do know that Loki managed to lure the king of the Jotun and a few of his men to Asgard where he killed them and thus averted a war," Thor replied. "But then he decided that that was not enough and he was going to use the Bifrost to destroy Jotunheim altogether." Jane's mouth dropped, horrified. "The Bifrost can do that?" Thor quickly realized what was worrying her. "Not usually, do not worry. The Bifrost is generally not dangerous as long as it is only left open for as long as it takes for people to travel through it. If it is continually left open, however, that was what Loki was planning to do. I tried but I could not reach the Bifrost to turn it off." "Even though you hated the Frost Giants, you still would not let them be destroyed," Jane said, odd. Thor swallowed uncomfortably. "I do not hate them," he said. The words were not quite true but he hoped that one day they would be. "And my feelings were not worth allowing an entire race of people to be wiped out over their actions thousands of years ago." "I wasn't trying to judge you or imply anything," Jane assured him immediately. "It's just, I know that your morality doesn't always line up with my morality being from 2 completely different worlds and I'm just glad that we agree on the no genocide thing." Loki had agreed in the past as well. Thor felt compelled to tell her. But there was just so much stress, I do not believe that he was thinking clearly. And then afterwards, I cannot even begin to guess what happened to him. After what? Jane asked curiously. I told you that I could close the Bifrost, but I was determined to save Jotunheim. Thor resumed his narrative. It was not even just about Jotunheim. I could not have a precedent be set of effortlessly destroying worlds like that. The only way I could see to stop the Bifrost destroying Jotunheim was to stop the connection. I had to destroy the bridge. I had to give up the chance to ever see you again. Thor watched Jane very closely for her reaction. I understand, Jane said softly. You would have kept your promise if you could, and I would have made the same decision. You can't just let an entire race of people die just because you want to see somebody again. You are a noble soul, Jane Foster, Thor said, greatly relieved. That's one way to put it, Jane said wryly. Not a sociopath is another. But you did keep your promise. Somehow, you're here now. After I stopped Loki from destroying Jotunheim, we both nearly fell off of the remains of the Bifrost, and my father, who has very good timing sometimes, caught us both. Loki tried to explain what he had done and why, but my father did not want Jotunheim destroyed, either. Loki decided to fling himself into the abyss, Thor said quietly. Jane's eyes widened. Why would he do that? I wish I knew, Thor replied. He has since decided that what actually happened was that I threw him into the abyss, and there is no persuading him otherwise. He used the Tesseract to send himself back to Earth, and when we found out that Loki was here, my father used a lot of dark energy to send me here as well. Once we recovered the Tesseract, we could come and go as we pleased, and the Bifrost is currently being repaired. Perhaps in the future I'll get a chance to see Asgard, Jane hinted. Thor grinned at her. But of course. His gaze turned thoughtful. Loki said that I should thank him for his attempt to conquer Midgard because it meant that I could be sent down here again. Thanks to his actions, though many died and it was absolutely deplorable, I have regained the ability to come and go as I wish. Will you thank him, then? Jane asked curiously. Thor snorted. Maybe one day, when I think that he won't use that gratitude for all that it is worth. Though Jane had only briefly seen Loki, she hazarded a guess. So you're never going to tell him? Never ever, Thor confirmed. Jane laughed at that. Once she'd stopped, however, she closed her eyes as if she were bracing herself for something unpleasant. Jane? Thor asked, concerned. I don't mean to be pushy, and I know that we just got reacquainted, but I've spent a great deal of time over the last year thinking about this, Jane began. So here goes. You and me, we kissed. We did, Thor agreed, smiling at the memory. I liked it. Jane blushed. I'm glad. So did I or we. Hear anyone else in your life? Or did you realize you made a mistake? Or did I want to see what could happen between us? Thor asked rhetorically. The answer is the last one. We barely know each other, Jane said reasonably. It might have felt like longer, and we went through some pretty amazing things together, but it was only 3 days a year ago. We could be terrible together. We could, Thor agreed. Or we could be wonderful together. Either way, don't you think that we deserve the chance to find out? Jane didn't answer verbally, but Thor rather thought the way she started kissing him almost desperately was her way of saying, yes. Loki looked up from the book that Stark had let him borrow after Banner had gotten unnerved with the way that Loki had been staring at him without moving. It is getting late. How long can they possibly be talking for? Stark laughed. I will bet you anything that they stopped talking ages ago. It is getting pretty late, though, Romanoff remarked. And we don't know if Thor and Jane will be out anytime soon. That's a good point, Stark agreed. Hey, you're probably going to end up staying the night, okay? Loki narrowed his eyes. Staying overnight in Midgard. That sounded horrifying, actually. The 2 nights he had spent there in the last 1,000 years had been spent in a sewer and when he was locked in Banner's cell. Great, Stark said. I'd show you to your room, except I don't feel like getting up. Jarvis? The same red lights that had led Thor and Jane away appeared on the ceiling. Loki glanced at them briefly before turning back to his book. Stark cleared his throat. And then when Loki didn't look up, he kept clearing it. Romanoff popped in earplugs but otherwise ignored him. Yes? Loki asked finally when Stark got to be too annoying to make ignoring him worth it. Aren't you going to go? Stark asked pointedly, jerking his head towards the ceiling. I was not planning on it, Loki replied coolly. Or you could always play cards with us, Barton offered, smiling darkly. Wordlessly, Loki stood and left the room. Barton was planning something and he was not in the mood to deal with it on a night he was forced to stay over in Midgard. He was tempted to find Thor and ask to be taken home, but there was always the chance that Thor really was having sex with Jane, and that was not something that Loki really needed to see. When he reached the room, he frowned at the plaque on the door. Phil Coulson Memorial Room, he read. Who was Phil Coulson? He opened the door and saw a medium-sized room with a bed in the corner, a lamp on the bedside table, and nothing but pictures of a man who looked almost familiar covering the walls. Loki wondered if he'd done something to this man and he was sent here to be made to feel guilty or something. Not that he would ever feel guilty about a mortal, but the odds were even lower without even knowing what he was supposed to be feeling guilty about. On what Loki was fairly sure was the last day before he had removed every bit of trash from every stretch of the highways around New York City, Agent Barton decided to come with him and Thor. Barton had yet to say more than 2 words to him, though he never forgot to glare. So perhaps now he was finally making his move. He had brought a large book with him with post-it notes marking several of the pages. Loki was growing more curious by the second, but he did not want to give Barton the satisfaction of appearing interested in his little scheme. Fortunately, he had Thor there to do it for him. "What book is it that holds your attention so?" Thor inquired, peering inquisitively over at the smirking man. "Oh, this," Barton tried for innocence, but he wasn't fooling Loki. "It's just a book Dr. Selvig recommended. Norse mythology, you know." Norse mythology, that was the one that they were in, wasn't it? He didn't know all that much about it, and honestly he had never cared to. He did not care what the humans thought of him, and he never had. It looked like now he was going to be forced to find out, though he'd be damned if he'd be the one to ask. Thor moved closer to Barton and looked at the page that he had open. "Is that supposed to be me?" Barton nodded. "What, you don't think it looks like you?" Thor poked at what Loki could only presume was the figure on the page. "My hair is red." "I was wondering about that. You were never a redhead, huh?" Barton asked rhetorically. Thor shook his head. "Well, except for that decade where Loki changed my hair color." "Why did he do that?" Barton asked. Thor shrugged. "I do not remember. I suspect it was at least partially because he found it funny." Barton spared Loki a glance. "Yeah, that guy is a regular laugh a minute. Hey, since this book got something as basic as your hair color wrong, chances are that it's got a lot of other things wrong too, huh?" "Well, it has been several hundred years since the last time we were really a presence here on Midgard, and they did not know much of us then, either," Thor said tolerantly. Barton nodded, and Loki did not trust this one bit. True. Hey, do you mind if I ask you some questions to try and clear up any misunderstandings?" "You may ask," Thor allowed. "I guess my first question is actually kind of about Loki," Barton admitted. "What a surprise." "Yes?" Thor asked, just a hint of wariness entering his tone. "You say that he is your brother, right?" Barton asked. "I do," Thor confirmed. "And one day he will stop fighting me on this." "I would not count the days," Loki spoke up. Barton turned the pages. "Well, according to this he's actually your step-uncle, I think." Thor frowned. "What do you mean?" "Well, he's not biologically your brother or even Asgardian at all. In fact, he's from Jotunheim, and he only lives with the gods because of some sort of trickery where he got to claim your father, Odin, as his blood brother even though he really wasn't," Barton explained. Thor shot him an alarmed glance that he did his best not to return. It was suddenly very difficult to breathe, but he forced the air into his lungs all the same, determined not to show any sign of weakness. Barton was inconsequential, even if he did not deserve to witness the foibles of a god. But he would not have Thor see him that way. "Come on guys," Barton said, honestly confused. "That seems like a pretty easy one. Is Loki your brother or young step-uncle or what?" Loki knew just what Thor was thinking because, for once, their thoughts were running along the same lines. How had the mortals known what he was centuries before anyone had known, before he had known? Was that what the people of Midgard thought of him? He had told them nothing and they assumed that he was a frost giant? How could this possibly be the case? It was impossible, and yet Thor was leaning over the book again with horrified fascination, so it must be in there. Barton couldn't have made such an astute guess, either, and Thor certainly wouldn't have told. He was ashamed of Loki's heritage even if he pretended otherwise and still sought to claim him as a brother, after all. "Sorry," Thor said, coughing. "It's just, that's really odd. Loki is my brother, I assure you. Does that book really say that my brother is a frost giant? Wherever would they have gotten that idea? Barton shook his head. Not a frost giant. No, it says that he's some sort of a fire giant. He doesn't really look like one, I've got to admit. Maybe they just didn't want their precious Asgardian gods to be the sort of villains that they portrayed Loki as. It would seem that, though their truth about his heritage was incomplete and a shot in the dark, they had picked up on his falling out with the others long before he had ever dreamed that such a thing could come to pass. It must have just been idle gossip, Thor said, relieved. Then he frowned. My brother is hardly a villain. Barton raised an eyebrow. Do you even want to know what the final death toll was? Thor shook his head. I would not. Barton snorted. I don't blame you. If I was trying to redeem someone, then I wouldn't want to know all the gory details either. Loki shot Thor a look. There was something he wanted to know, but he did not intend to ask it himself. Thor correctly understood his looks about 50% of the time, and this percentage was markedly higher when what Loki wanted him to do did not run counter to his own interests. Fortunately, luck was on his side for once. Out of curiosity, who were Loki's Jotun parents? Barton flipped through the book again. It says here that he was the son of Farbauti and Laufey. Thor winced. Since the Laufey part was true, the part about Farbauti, whoever she was, might have been true as well. What? Barton asked, suspiciously. I thought this wasn't true. It's not, exactly, Thor claimed, and Loki could have cursed him for that, exactly. It's just, Loki killed the frost giant king, Laufey, last year when he was threatening to go to war with us. Barton snorted. Patricide, huh? Can't say that I'm surprised. Suddenly his eyes widened and he looked carefully at the text. He started to laugh then. What? Loki asked, annoyed. King Laufey, as in Laufey was male? Barton wanted to know. He was indeed, Loki confirmed. Why? According to this, Laufey was your mother and Farbauti was your father, Barton explained, still chortling. Though that was hardly the only time gender did not have the final say on childbearing. Loki decided that he really didn't want to know. What about Helblindi and Bylister? Barton asked. Are they around? They might be, Thor said, frowning, though I cannot say that I have heard of them. They are supposed to be Loki's brothers, Barton replied. Thor's face darkened. I am Loki's brother. The man can have more than one brother, Barton pointed out. I do not know if Laufey and Farbauti, or Laufey and anybody, had sons by that name. Since I would have killed their father, I do not believe our crossing paths would be beneficial, Loki said evenly. Did he have brothers out there besides? Did he have brothers out there? He hoped not. If he had to be a frost giant, then the last thing he wanted was to have people out there that would remind him of this fact. Let's talk about Sif, Barton suggested. Sif? Thor asked, brightening. She is a dear friend of mine. Just a friend? Barton asked pointedly. Thor frowned. I do not understand. There is nothing, just, about friendship, Clint. Barton shook his head. No, that wasn't what I mean. I was asking if you were married to her. Thor started choking then. What? Marriage, Sif? Barton shrugged. That's what the book says. Golden-haired Sif had several children with unpronounceable names with Thor and was associated with the earth and fertility. She had her hair shaved off by Loki, for some reason, and he got into a lot of trouble trying to fix it. Thor's eyes were flashing. I would never dishonor Sif or Jane or any other woman for that relationship with one woman while married to another. It is, in fact, debatable whether he recognizes that Sif is a female at all, but should he do so they'll probably get married, Loki opined. Thor laughed. Oh, brother. If anything, I'd say Sif is more likely to end up marrying you. Loki frowned at him. You remember the part where she dearly hates me, yes? Thor tilted his head. She may still be a little upset about the time you tried to kill them and me and refusing to end my exile, but she'll get over it. I have seen the two of you talking and, as my human friend Darcy puts it, the chemistry is crackling. Loki was not entirely sure what chemistry was, but it hardly mattered. I think you are confusing chemistry with intense dislike. We shall see, brother, Thor said, waggling his eyebrows. It was a rather disturbing sight. You're just saying that because it would be awkward for you to be with that mortal when one of your closest friends is in love with you, Loki argued. Okay, Barton said slowly. I'm going to put that one down as will likely stay single for the foreseeable future as her two options are fighting over which one won't have to be with her. Thor winced immediately. It's not like that. Sif is a friend and a good one, but, Jane. Barton smiled slowly. I quite understand. Thor nodded. Ah, yes, you and Natasha. A look that might have been horror passed over Barton's face. What? Thor shook his head. Never mind. To correct your story, Loki never cut Sif's hair, although he did change it from blonde to black many years ago. And she is not really connected with fertility or the earth as far as I know. She is a warrior and one of the best I've ever seen. To be fair, Loki added, she asked me to do it. She was tired of Fandral passing her off as his sister, so she had to listen to all of the complaints about his lascivious behavior while he ran off and hid. I see, Barton said, nodding. So Loki never had his mouth sewn shut? He actually seemed disappointed. He almost did, once, Thor told him. There was some trouble with dwarves. I never did get all the details because Loki did not wish to speak of it, and once I arrived and rescued Loki, the dwarves were not inclined to explain either. You cut it a little close, Loki said, a little crossly. They had me restrained and had threaded the needle. One thing I did glean was that you had lost your head, but not your neck, in a bet, so maybe if you had not have done that then it would not have gotten to that point, Thor countered, crossing his arms. I was not supposed to lose, Loki exclaimed. Thor rolled his eyes. People rarely are, and yet it happens all the time. Barton turned disappointed eyes on Thor. You couldn't have taken the scenic route? Thor grinned. Who says I didn't? Thor, Loki said, annoyed. What? Thor asked innocently. I arrived on time and I believe the extra time to contemplate your choices was good for you. Giving me extra time to think is never good for people, Loki declared. Now that I believe, Barton muttered. So, cross-dressing in Jotunheim. What is this, cross-dressing? Thor asked curiously. Dressing up as a woman, Barton supplied. Thor froze. No, that never happened. Not even when you lost Mjolnir and you had to, Barton started to say. It never happened. Thor insisted. It had, actually, but if Thor didn't want to admit to it then that was fine with him. That had not been one of his prouder moments, though he supposed that it had gone better than the last time the pair had gone to that icy wasteland together. Though maybe if it hadn't been for the wedding travesty then Thor wouldn't have been called a little princess, or, if he had, he wouldn't have reacted so strongly. And maybe he would never have learned about, but, no, worrying about that was ridiculous. Alright, then, Barton said, giving Thor a strange look. So do either of you have any children? Thor, you already said you had none by Sif, but what about with, I'm going to go with Jarnsaxa. Thor glanced at the page. Jarnsaxa. No, who is that? She's a Jotun who, Barton began. No, Thor cried out, disgusted. No, why would I ever want to? He caught Loki's eye and stilled. I mean, merely touching the skin of a Jotun will cause your flesh to burn. Having sex with one would not end well for me. Barton winced sympathetically. As if Loki really took it personally that Thor was disgusted at the idea of sex with a Jotun. He was, too, for that matter. So no Magni? Barton asked, probably just so he could say a name that he could pronounce. Okay, then. Do you feel the same way about Jotun, Loki? I feel stronger than Thor about it, Loki said quietly. Thor nodded at that, probably remembering which one of them had nearly managed to completely, save one, eradicate them from the galaxy. So you wouldn't have hooked up with Anger, Barton trailed off. A little help here, Thor? These names are killing me. Anger Boa, Thor supplied. Is she a frost giant? Loki asked calmly. The book only calls her a giant, but do you guys only have the one kind? Barton asked. Yes, Thor answered. Then yes, she's a frost giant, Barton told him. I would rather die, Loki said coldly. Barton looked like he wanted to say something here but managed to restrain himself. He really means that, Thor vouched for him. That's probably for the best, Barton said at last. What do you mean? Thor asked curiously. Well, the 3 children he had with her were kind of, I'm going to go with, abomination against nature, Barton said delicately. I'm sure they couldn't be that bad, Thor said confidently. Barton flipped a few pages and then gestured to the page. Thor's eyes had never been so wide. Are you, really? Oh, brother. What? Loki snapped, not terribly invested in the children he did not have but irritated to be left out once again. The three children were Fenrir, Hel, and Jormungandr, Barton informed him. Hey, did I get that one right? Thor nodded. I believe you did. Congratulations, Clint. Barton grinned, pleased at his marginal success rate. They were different. Hell, Loki repeated. As in that place that humans think that their souls will go after they die if they displease their god? One, L, not two, but it's pronounced the same, Barton replied. I think. It's how I'm going to pronounce it at any rate. She was cast out by the gods for being evil or a freak of nature or something, and she rules over her underworld realm, also called Hell. Asgard is legendary for its tolerance, Loki said dryly, idly wondering if he was supposed to work up some sort of outrage on behalf of this daughter that wasn't. Jormungandr was a giant serpent that one day got too big to be kept in Asgard, and so Odin tossed him into the great ocean that encircled Midgard. He surrounds the earth and grasps at his own tail. When he lets go, the world will end, Barton read. Why? Thor asked. Barton blinked. What do you mean, why? Why will the world end when he stops grasping his tail? Thor pressed. Barton shrugged. I don't know. If he doesn't even exist, then what does it matter? Maybe these stories foretell the future, Thor suggested. Do you anticipate the both of us procreating with Jotun? Loki demanded. Thor shuddered. Maybe not. Apparently Jormungandr is Thor's archenemy, Barton said. Thor frowned, considering. I suppose that a serpent giant enough to encircle the entire world and who will one day end it would be a worthy foe. I do not approve of fighting my nephew, though. He's not your nephew, Loki pointed out. I know, Thor replied. But if he existed then he would be. That wasn't what I meant, Loki said tiredly. I know, Thor said again. The last one is Fenrir. He is a monstrous wolf foretold to one day kill Odin and who bit off the right hand of Tyr. Due to the prophecy and the rapid growth, the gods had him bound forever, Barton concluded. Thor stared at him. Loki, why do you have such monstrous offspring? Loki reminded him. And if I did then they would not be those things. And let's not even get started on Sleipnir, Barton said, not even trying to conceal his mirth. Sleipnir? Loki demanded. Now I fathered my father's horse? Thor perked up at that, but Loki ignored him. The worst thing you could do with mistakes was to draw attention to them by attempting to correct them. Actually, Barton corrected, clearly loving every second of this, you birthed him. You are making this up, Loki accused. I could not if I tried, Barton said cheerfully. He held out the book. Here, look. I would rather not, Loki said, glaring at him. Oh look, Thor offered. He took the book and started to skim. What? Now that can't be. Well, at least it was for a good cause. What? Loki demanded. Oh, now you want to know, Barton said smugly. I should just not tell you. But no, this is too good for that. Thor? Long ago, an unnamed builder offered to build a wall around Asgard in exchange for the goddess Freyja, the sun, and the moon. The gods agreed as long as it is done within 3 seasons with the help of no man. You convinced them to let his horse, Svafari, assist. Svafari was extremely strong, and with 3 days left in the bargain the wall is nearly finished, Thor told him. Everyone blamed you and decided that you would die a horrible death if you did not get them out of the bet. You turned yourself into a mare and ran by Svafari to distract him. It worked, but you were with child when you returned and soon gave birth to Sleipnir, who you gave to father. Oh, and apparently the builder was a Jotun, and so they called me in to kill him. The gods of the story were kind of assholes, Barton summarized. There were no words. It never happened, Thor said firmly. I know not where father got Sleipnir, but Loki did not bear him. Did the gods hate you and threaten to kill you in Asgard? Barton asked. Because they seem to do it a lot in the mythology. I almost wondered why you stuck around. Yes, they did, Loki confirmed bitterly. They never threatened to kill me, but that was because I was Odin's son, but they wanted to. Thor rolled his eyes. Oh, they did not. Loki's pranks annoyed them when they were directed at them, but it really wasn't that bad. Because you're perfectly objective on the matter, Loki said coldly. More objective than you, I would say, Thor replied. Is Baldur alive? Barton wondered. I know not, Thor replied. Who is he supposed to be? Barton stared at him. Your brother. I have but one brother, and that is Loki, Thor said proudly. Okay, so I'm guessing that whole story never happened, Barton murmured. Good to know. What story? Loki asked, wanting to get on a topic that didn't involve him having monstrous children. But then, what other kind of child could a monster produce? He almost felt nauseous. Balder always kind of annoyed me, to be honest, Barton admitted. That probably means that there is something wrong with me. Tell me, Thor instructed. He's pretty much the best god out there. He's the second son of Odin and the wisest, kindest, most all-around perfect god. Really boring. I kind of want to punch him just reading about him, Barton admitted. I can relate, Loki told him. He sounds nice, Thor defended his imaginary brother. I know, Loki said, groaning. Apparently his death starts the chain of events that lead to Ragnarok, Barton revealed. He and his mother dreamed that he would die, and so Frigga made every living thing on earth except for Mistletoe swear not to hurt him. Mistletoe was either too young to swear or seemed too harmless to bother asking. Mythology Loki apparently felt the same way that real Loki did, for he immediately got either a spear or an arrow made out of mistletoe. Everyone knows that plants can't talk, Thor complained. A weapon out of mistletoe? Loki asked, disgusted. Really? Will you just let me finish? Barton demanded. The gods were apparently stupid, so they all delighted in throwing things at Balder since it all harmlessly bounced off of him. Thor, another of Odin's sons. My father really does only have 2 children, Thor insisted. Was given this spear or arrow by Loki. Since he was blind, he did not know what it was, and so he accidentally killed his brother. Odin and a Jotun named Rindr gave birth to another child who grew up within a day and killed Thor, Barton continued. That doesn't seem fair, Thor protested. He didn't do it on purpose, and since he was blind anyone would know that. And why would my father need to have an entirely new child to kill him? And why is everyone procreating with Jotun? Loki demanded. Apparently the gods were just cheating assholes, Barton said, unconcerned. Thor glared at him. Barton held up his hands. What? I'm just going by the myths. If you don't like it, take it up with the Vikings. Balder's wife killed herself because she couldn't bear her grief and everyone just sort of let her, Barton told them. Frigga begged Hel to release her son and she agreed if everyone in existence wept for him. Because he was annoyingly perfect, everyone did except for a giantess that was really Loki in disguise. When the gods found out about that, well, they did not react well. I'll just bet, Loki said grimly. What did they do? This part freaked even me out a little, Barton admitted. Are you sure you want to know? If I had to listen to all of that prattle about Odin's perfect son, then I want to know what these mortals would have happened to me, Loki said firmly. Don't say I didn't warn you, Barton said under his breath. Thor hunted you down. Of course he did, Loki muttered, casting an annoyed glance at Thor. You were taken to a cave and your 2 sons by your wife Sigyn. Have you heard of her? Barton broke off to ask. No, Loki replied. Don't tell me, another Jotun? Not that I'm aware, actually, Barton answered. And your 2 sons with her don't appear to be abominations, so that's something. I suppose. Of course, now if I ever did meet a Sigyn I could never marry her, Loki announced. Thor frowned. Why is this, brother? She might be a wonderful person who you could really love. With my luck, she probably is, Loki agreed. But it matters not. I dislike following any sort of fate, and I refuse to follow the fate that mortals have laid out for me even more. Unless, of course, it came to his being fated to be a monster. That was really more species than destiny, though, and so it didn't quite count. Thor just shook his head. I don't understand why you always have to be so difficult. Of course he didn't. Thor never understood these matters. Just because he knew that certain things were inevitable, however, did not mean that he had to welcome them. Your son Vali was turned into a wolf. Not sure why they didn't just use your son Fenrir, but I guess they didn't want to let him go and wanted you to watch this. And ripped apart your son Narfi. Then you were bound to rocks by Narfi's entrails, Barton said, making a face. A snake was put just above your face and kept dripping venom on you. Your wife Sigyn elected to not kill the snake but instead catch the venom in a bowl. Every now and again, she had to empty the bowl and did not do so fast enough to avoid you being splashed with the venom and causing earthquakes with your writhing. And that's where you were to be eternally imprisoned until Ragnarok. Thor had a look of great horror upon his face. Oh, brother, I am so sorry. I do not see why, Loki said calmly. This did not actually happen and it never will, with so many of the key figures simply not existing. But still, I do not see how we could be so cruel, Thor protested. I do, Loki told him, but really, it is no matter. I'm going to have to talk to Father about this, Thor said seriously, apparently not listening. Loki sighed. Whatever you want to waste the All-Father's time with, I suppose. What happened with Ragnarok? Ah, that, Barton said, nod you the pages yet again. Perhaps unsurprisingly, once you finally broke free you were on the Jotun's side against the gods. We would have deserved it, Thor said glumly. Almost everything in the universe is destroyed at the end of the battle, Barton informed them. It has a lot of outcomes listed here, but the ones that might interest you, I think, are when Fenrir ate Odin but then his son Vidar avenged him. Thor killed his nephew Jormungandr but then walked 9 paces and died from the venom. Apparently the Vikings had some sort of 9 obsession. And Loki and Heimdall mortally wounded each other, but Loki refused to die until he had seen the world end. Thor was, inexplicably, looking pleased now. How can you possibly be happy to hear of your death? Loki demanded. I died killing a giant snake that was so big it engulfed the world and who it was said that letting go of its tail would signify the end of the world, Thor said happily. And look at you. You got to die killing Heimdall. That man can not only survive but barely be slowed down by a blast from the world-destroying casket. I seem to recall he was a little more than barely slowed down, Loki said sullenly. It froze him for at least an hour. And the casket has the power to destroy worlds, Thor said again as if that were the important thing. This is quite the accomplishment, brother. I am glad that we did not have to fight each other, though. I still don't understand your reaction to any of this, Thor, Barton admitted, shaking his head. Well, it helps that this will never come to pass in this way, Thor admitted. Also, it's an Asgard thing, Loki said as contemptuously as he could. It is an Asgard thing, Thor agreed, and, as such, do not even pretend that you do not relish the thought of being capable of killing Heimdall. Loki considered it. Maybe, but this proves nothing. When Loki and Thor returned to Asgard that night, Loki automatically turned towards the prison cell he had been staying in, but Thor hadn't moved. He waited, but it looked like Thor wasn't going to move anytime soon. He sighed. He didn't really want to ask, but he didn't want to stand around engaged in a silent battle of wills with Thor, either. His mind was still reeling from everything that the Midgardians had believed about him. Apparently not even those who worshipped him as a god particularly liked him. Barton claimed that he and Thor were actually 2 of the most popular, but not only did being told how popular Thor was not make him feel better, but he really had no reason to trust Barton, either. He was probably just saying that so that he could reveal otherwise later. And he didn't actually care what Midgardians thought of him, anyway. Is everything alright? He asked curtly. Yes, it's fine, Thor agreed easily enough. Then why are you still standing there? Loki inquired. You're going the wrong way, Thor replied. Loki frowned, vaguely offended. I think that by now I know the way to my cell. And even if I hadn't been going there every night since my return to Asgard, I've spent enough centuries in the palace that I think it's safe to say that I know every nook and cranny of it. You do, Thor acknowledged. Loki took a steadying breath. Thor never made conversations easy. Then why, pray tell, do you believe that I am going the wrong way? Thor's face lit up and Loki cringed inwardly. Every time Thor looked that happy about something, he usually said or did something that he thought would make Loki happy, but it rarely did. It was just so awkward when he was expected to enjoy something but didn't, and Thor was looking at him like he didn't understand how this could be. One would think that over the centuries Thor would have just given it up, but Thor never was very good at giving up on anything. We have decided that, as you've completed the first step on your path to inevitable redemption, Thor started to say. Loki had to interrupt him here. My first step? You've made a list of steps? Does this mean that if I finish all of them without being redeemed that you'll just give it up? Thor nodded and then shook his head and then, looking a little confused, nodded again. You realize that that was not in any way helpful, I trust, Loki said dryly. Allow me to explain, Thor began. He stopped. Loki raised an eyebrow. Well, I'm waiting. Thor blinked. Sorry. Normally, you never give me a chance to explain. Well, this time I am absolutely fascinated to hear what you have to say, Loki told him. We have made a list of steps for you to complete on your path to redemption, Thor informed him. We thought that that would be more efficient than trying to think of something new after every task you have completed. Tony suggested a 12-step program, but Pepper Potts did not like that idea and suggested that I do not enable him. I do not understand what she was referring to, but I have agreed that we will not have our plan be a 12-step one. What if I were to be very near redemption after 11 steps and do not need a full 13? Loki inquired. Thor smiled. You would be just that difficult, brother. I suppose we would have to add an extra step just to make absolutely sure that you were redeemed and to not displease Pepper. And to answer your other question, if we run out of steps and you are still not redeemed, then I am confident that we can think of more. The others had a lot of suggestions. Loki thought back to their smirking faces. I am hardly surprised, but you were saying about why I am going the wrong way. Thor's brow furrowed before he nodded. Ah, yes. Since you have now completed the first step on your path to redemption, we have decided that you may move back into your old room. It's been kept just the way you left it, except the sheets have been changed and it's been cleaned. Well, it would be nice not to have to deal with all of the dust that would have accumulated from over a year gone, but that really wasn't the point. Loki closed his eyes briefly. Thor, we've talked about this. Moving you back into your old room? Thor asked. I do not believe we have. Unless by we, of course, you actually mean mother, father, and myself. But I do not know why you would say we, then, because you would not be involved. Loki shook his head. No, not that. We've talked about your bizarre insistence of not actually treating me like a prisoner. I am a prisoner, am I not? Thor nodded. Until you are redeemed, yes. But since you have already been partially redeemed, then I do not see why we need to keep you in a prison cell. It pains me to think of my little brother languishing away in a prison cell. Loki narrowed his eyes. Little brother? We don't even know which one of us is older. Thor tilted his head. Technically, perhaps, but I'm taller and I was always raised as the elder. Not that the favoritism started that young or anything, Loki muttered. Thor sighed. I had to be declared the oldest, Loki. The court already knew about me and mother had to fake a pregnancy. However, if you'll agree to be redeemed right now, then I will let you be the eldest brother. I'm not your brother, Loki ground out. And you can't just say, I'm redeemed now, and be redeemed. Agree to disagree, Thor said merrily. Well, if you're sure, then I suppose I will, reluctantly, continue to think of you as my little brother. And I'm hardly languishing, Loki pointed out. If it weren't for the locked door, bars on the window, and guard out front, then it wouldn't even count as a prison cell. Thor frowned. As far as I've heard, those are the only qualifications for a prison cell. I know for a fact that we did not have a cell like that before I left, Loki insisted. Thor shrugged. Yes, well, you were gone for more than a year, brother. Changes will be made. Changes, perhaps, but this was absurd. The room had been painted his favorite color and the hard stone was traded in for normal flooring. It was also located where once 4 cells stood back to back, but the walls had been knocked down. The bed was very different from standard prison cots and was instead the same as the ones in the guest bedroom. There were several books he had not read as well, even if some of those books were clearly Midgardian. He even had a fireplace. Who in their right mind gave their prisoner a fireplace? And then, of course, none of the other cells had been altered in the slightest. Loki would never say that Asgardian prisoners were abominably treated, but they at least were treated as prisoners and received plain oatmeal, a leg of mutton, and a sandwich every day as opposed to the variety of dishes Loki was presented with. And now, after I clean up a little trash, and how that is easing me towards redemption is beyond me, Loki started to say. This time it was Thor's turn to interrupt him. It's simple. You're getting along better with the other Avengers. He trailed off at the skeptical look on Loki's face. Well, you haven't tried to kill them since you were captured, and that is an improvement at this point. You have been doing good for the community and even went above and beyond and ensured that there would not be a repeated incidence of trash on the beautiful grass along the highway. Loki hadn't trusted that they would not have him repeatedly cleaning up the highways forever, and future littering would just make him feel like his time was even more wasted than he already believed that it was. You still cannot leave the palace, and once you progress to being allowed to do that, then you still will not be allowed to use the Bifrost, Thor continued. Except, I suppose, for when I use it every day to go down to Midgard, the planet that I nearly conquered, Loki countered. What difference did that make to him? Really? He didn't really have any desire to leave the palace or to travel to another realm. He didn't really have a desire to do anything just then, and that might explain why he improvised is a completely different story, of course, Thor agreed, but it wasn't that close. I was absurdly close, Loki argued. If those humans had not sent a nuclear weapon at their own city and Stark had not redirected it to the Chitauri ships, then I would have succeeded. We would have been fine, Thor insisted. Believe that if it makes you feel better, Loki said magnanimously. I don't need to feel better, I actually won, Thor claimed. But perhaps that is why you need to believe that you almost won. Well, fine, I will not take that from you. Don't you dare humor me, Loki growled. I'm not humoring you, Thor said unconvincingly. Loki was sitting on his bed and reading one of his favorite books. It had been so long since he had had a chance to. When he heard a knock on the door. Immediately, Loki slid the book under his pillow. Just because he wasn't going to make himself miserable on purpose by ignoring the presence of all of his things didn't mean that he was willing to let anybody else know this. The appearance of scorning everything was still useful, after all. What? He asked, keeping his voice as monotonous as possible. As much as he would have liked to ignore whoever this person was, it was frankly a surprise that they had been so gracious as to knock, and he would like to maintain the illusion of power that answering would allow him to do. He wouldn't invite them in, but they would probably accept his reply as an invitation. And a part of him was curious as to who this mystery visitor was. He hadn't really seen anyone but Thor since arriving back on Midgard, and Loki wasn't entirely sure that Thor understood the concept of knocking. He certainly never had any use for it, which is why Loki had long since taken to magicking the door shut when he really wanted some privacy. Even that had to be used sparingly, however, because Thor usually concluded that something terrible had happened to him and made all sorts of racket trying to help. And Thor had always been trying to get into his room for one reason or another. He never could seem to exist without an audience. The door quietly swung open and Frigga slipped inside. Loki realized he was holding his breath and forced himself to resume breathing normally. He hadn't seen her since she had hugged him and thanked him for saving herself and Odin and told him how proud Odin would be when he awoke. He hadn't seen her since she had run to embrace Thor as well and had turned back to him in disbelieving horror once Thor revealed what Loki had been up to recently. Mother. That was a slip, wasn't it? If Odin was not his father and Thor was not his brother, then Frigga could not be his mother. And yet he had never really stopped thinking of her that way, when he'd had time to think of her at all. Odin had lied to him all his life and had favored Thor and let him think his own people were monsters, which, despite being true, was really terrible parenting. Frigga had not gone against him, but one simply did not go against the Almighty Allfather. And Thor had forced Loki to live in his shadow for so many years and had only stopped to pay attention to Loki once he had tried to wipe out a species or two. Even now, though, it was still all about Thor. Loki could accept that Thor meant well, but all the well-meaning in the world couldn't make it any less obnoxious or make him any less sick of it. Loki. It was remarkable how much warmth there was in her voice. Oh, my son, how I have missed you. You haven't come to see me before now, Loki said quietly, hoping he didn't sound as accusatory as he suddenly felt. Frigga sighed and moved yet closer to the bed. Loki did his best not to tense up. He told himself firmly that it did not matter how close she got or what she did. I wanted to, Frigga told him earnestly, in that way of hers that he never could help but believe. I really did. I was not sure how you would react, though. I know that you did not return to us by choice. Loki's face twisted into a grimace. No, I did not. And I am sorry for that, Frigga continued, sorry that things have devolved to this point. Loki felt a tugging at his heartstrings. And while he would usually ignore it, especially if Thor were there, this was Frigga. She was the only one in his life who hadn't betrayed him. You shouldn't be sorry, he said softly. None of this is your fault. Fault aside, my baby boy is hurting, so how can I not be sorry? Frigga asked him sadly. Loki managed a wry smile and closed his eyes. I'm not a child, mother. You will always be my baby boy, Loki, no matter what else you choose to be, Frigga assured him. Like a genocidal maniac bent on punishing Thor for my imagined slights, Loki challenged. I do not know why you chose to do what you did, Frigga admitted. I may never know unless you choose to tell me. Loki knew that he never could. The last thing she needed was to find out what it was that could drive a man to such lengths. The Chitauri weren't known for their sentiment. But I do know that no one should be made to feel like their feelings aren't important or are wrong, especially by those that are close to them, Frigga told him. There were very real slights in your past. There are slights in everyone's pasts. Yours were, like everyone's, more serious than some and less serious than others. It was a proper, diplomatic answer from Asgard's queen. But you don't think it justifies what I did? It wasn't a question. I find that very few things justify genocide, Frigga said dryly. They're monsters, Loki whispered harshly. Frigga moved closer still and sat down on the bed. Loki moved his legs to make room for her. She took his face in her hands. Loki, you're not a monster. He tried to look away but she wouldn't let him go. I never said that I was. For a moment, Loki was afraid that she would tell him that he were acting as if it were true. And even if that were true, who wanted to hear that they were behaving like a monster from their mother? But all she said, as she released him, was, I just wanted to make sure that you knew that. Why wouldn't I know that? Loki asked rhetorically. Frigga shrugged. I do not know. It is clear that you are nothing like a monster. The humans I've encountered would disagree, Loki replied. Frigga frowned, offended on his behalf. From what I've heard of Midgardians, they are quite strange. Then why are you allowing Thor to continually take me down there to try to redeem me? Loki asked, his eyes narrowed. Frigga smiled wanly, because I want him to succeed. Annoyed, Loki turned away from her. Of course. It's not like precious Thor can ever possibly be allowed to fail at something. What will his fragile ego do then? Loki, Frigga said quietly, sounding almost hurt. Loki refused to look at her and see for certain. Loki, Frigga said again. I'm not your enemy and I never was. With that she pulled him into a hug and he could have fought it but he didn't. Thor came into the dining area that morning looking far more pleased with himself than he usually did. Now, Thor not looking at all pleased with himself was a cause for concern but that didn't mean that any excess smugness was entirely harmless. The warriors Three and Sif engaged in a silent battle of wills to see who would have to be the one to ask him what was going on. Or rather, Fandral, Volstagg, and Sif did. They were well aware how futile it was to expect Hogun to be the one to speak up. Fandral lost and threw himself back in his chair, annoyed. Thor, he greeted their friend. You seem chipper. Thor's grin only widened. We had better not be going off to get ourselves killed before breakfast. Volstagg grumbled suspiciously before taking an extra large bite of his food just in case. I think going off to get ourselves killed would get in the way of the Loki redeeming, Sif comforted him. I can't imagine much progress has been made on that front. That's actually what I wanted to speak to you about, Thor declared. His four friends groaned. What? Fandral asked him. We haven't said anything to him that might upset him. You also haven't actually spoken to him since he got back, Thor pointed out. It is difficult to speak to one who is never here and imprisoned when he is, Hogun replied. True, Thor agreed. But since the redeeming is going so well, last night he moved back to his old room and this morning he's coming to breakfast. Volstagg started choking. I'll translate, Sif said dryly. Really? Already? What's been going on down there on Midgard? Thor glanced at the ceiling innocently, redeeming. We didn't know what you meant at first but now that you've clarified I feel we have a much better understanding of the situation, Fandral said sarcastically. I just wanted to let you know that Loki would be here soon so that you would not be unduly surprised and react badly when he gets here, Thor said, ignoring that. Are you sure this is such a good idea? Hogun asked him quietly. Thor shrugged. What good would waiting do? In fact, the longer he goes without seeing you the more awkward it is bound to get and I see no reason to delay. You and he cannot avoid each other forever. We can make a good effort, Sif offered. I'll be back momentarily, Thor promised before leaving again and leaving them to their own devices. The four of them sat silently for a moment aside from the sound of Volstagg eating. Well, I suppose there's no getting around this, then, Volstagg said finally. We promised that we'd play nice with Loki and now the time has come for us to actually make good on that promise. What did we even talk to him about? Fandral wondered. I don't even remember, Sif admitted, putting her head in her hands. It's only been a year, Fandral reminded them. This really shouldn't be so difficult. A lot has happened in a year, Hogun pointed out. And we never had to ask ourselves what to talk to Loki about, I remember that, Volstagg added. We just talked to him about anything we felt like talking to him about. You would think, then, that it would be easier to find something to discuss, Sif remarked. Though, of course, then we didn't have to avoid talking about the one thing we all wanted to talk about. We don't necessarily have to avoid mentioning any of it at all, Fandral said slowly. We just have to be very careful that we do not say something that could be seen as judging or that Loki might take offense to. It is impossible to predict what Loki will take offense to, Sif complained. It might not be so difficult if he would admit when he is offended instead of leaving you to figure it out on your own who knows how long later, making it difficult to pinpoint when the offense was caused, Hogun opined. We could sit in awkward silence, Volstagg offered. Sif thought about it for a moment before shaking her head. That will never work. Thor will take it as a sign that we need to bond some more and force us to continue spending time with him until we find something to talk about and things go back to normal. He'll likely do that anyway, Fandral told her. Sif shrugged. You're probably right, but even so, sitting in silence will not help us. I've always found making awkward conversation is far less awkward than sitting in awkward silence, Volstagg said, stretching. At least that way both parties are equally uncomfortable, whereas if you're dealing with a fellow like Hogun, then he can out-silence you any day. Hogun nodded modestly. If Loki does feel uncomfortable ever, he does not show it, and so this may not work. At least we'll be annoying him, Volstagg replied. Probably, we can dream. Why not just let Thor carry the conversation? Fandral suggested. He enjoys being the center of things, and if Loki's really making such wonderful progress, then he should be able to know how to talk to him better than any of us. And after all, it's his brother. Sif opened her mouth to respond when the door swung open and Loki walked in, alone. Where's Thor? She asked instead. Loki looked briefly annoyed. He walked with me all the way here before suddenly remembering that he forgot something important on the other side of the palace. He assured me that he will return as swiftly as he is able. Ah, Sif said, understanding immediately. Thor was going to force them to communicate with his recently evil little brother without being able to use him as a crutch. He was probably watching them right now. For lack of anything better to say, she continued with, "It's good to see you again." "Is it?" Loki asked idly. It was, actually. Asgard was not the same without Loki, for all that he was strange and difficult to understand and annoyed her beyond reason half the time. Sif never did like change, and the death, or supposed death, of one of them was a big change indeed. And Loki was no ordinary Asgardian, he was Thor's brother and the Allfather's son. And she couldn't stand to see the royal family mourn. So yes, it was good to see Loki again, but not particularly for his sake. "We thought you were dead," Volstagg told him. "So I've heard," Loki said calmly. He walked over to their table and took a seat a few places away from them. He used his magic to bring a plate and utensils to him, and then, instead of asking them to pass the food like a normal person, magicked some of it onto his plate and began eating. He was always doing things like that. Sif never could decide if he was showing off or just feeling lazy. Maybe both. Sif didn't much see the point, but then she was hardly a sorcerer like Loki was, and since he couldn't fight normally, it made sense that he would want to feel useful where he could. "You can forgive us for making the mistake," Fandral spoke up. "You did fall into an abyss." "Fall, throne, it's all the same, really," Loki said in that same detached manner. Fandral exchanged a look with her. They had heard that Loki, in a mysterious incident involving frost giants breaking into Asgard and trying to murder the king, and that had led to the Bifrost being destroyed, had fallen into an abyss, and that there had been nothing anyone could have done to save him. Clearly Loki remembered it differently, but, this being Loki, that didn't necessarily mean anything, and talking about it wasn't likely to get them anywhere. "I am impressed that you survived," Hogun said, nodding respectfully at Loki. "I do not believe that many would." "You are probably right," Loki agreed. Well, Loki clearly had no intention of being helpful. Sif wished that she could say that it was a surprise. Even back before Loki had tried to kill them and they had been friends, Loki very rarely felt the need to be helpful. Usually it was only if their lives were in danger or his concern for Thor was greater than his amusement at their situation. "So, I heard that you killed Laufey," Fandral said awkwardly. Loki nodded, actually looking faintly pleased. "So I did." "What happened?" Sif asked. half curious and half desperate to find something to fill the sea, took pity on them and came back. Loki raised an eyebrow elegantly. What? Thor didn't tell you? He told us only that frost giants, including their king, had somehow found their way to Asgard and you killed Loki right as he was about to strike the Allfather down, Sif answered primly. Somehow, Loki echoed, shaking his head. Sentiment. What? Sif asked, not understanding what he was talking about. Do you know more? More than Thor? Loki inquired. Usually. Sif suppressed the flicker of annoyance she felt at that as she firmly believed that mealtimes should not be sullied with something so petty as an argument. It would seem that, despite everything that had transpired since Thor's banishment, Loki still had not gotten over his jealousy of Thor. She didn't know whether to be annoyed at how very hopeless Loki could be sometimes or relieved that at least there were some things that were still the same. So what happened? Sif pressed. Just what Thor said happened, Loki said simply. Loki and his men came to Asgard, they attempted to kill the Allfather, and I killed them. Sif frowned. The Allfather? Since when do you call your father that? Loki ignored the question. If you'd like to know more about how the frost giants came to Asgard in the first place, then I suggest you ask your brother. We did, actually, Volstagg told him. Heimdall says he can't remember. We are all rather impressed, you know, Fandral spoke up, with the way that you killed Loki and all. Not even your own father managed that. I've often wondered about that, Loki said thoughtfully. Legend tells that at the end of the war he broke into Loki's chambers and woke Loki with a sword to his throat before having him agree to a treaty. It would have been so simple to kill him then. It would have been without honor, Sif said, blinking. Loki looked at her like she was being a child. It was a war. It was the end of one, she countered. And killing their king would make them far less likely to agree to a peace. Or it might have broken their spirits and convinced them that stopping was the only option, Loki argued. Instead, they left a bitter and defeated king to fester in his failure for centuries. Is it any wonder he wanted to murder his foe so badly? Ultimately, things worked out just fine, Sif claimed. The casket was taken and so they could not wage war again and things have stayed peaceable, more or less, since then. Who knows what would have happened had Loki been killed? Loki shook his head. That's just it. I know. Thor bravely brought us to the brink of war and yet killing Loki put an end to any thought of that, didn't it? Sif wanted to ask how Loki could possibly know that given that he was gone doing whatever it was that he was doing when he hadn't bothered to let anyone know that he was alive, but he could likely extrapolate since they weren't actually at war now. You can't expect the knowledge gained after the fact to shape the decisions of the past. Perhaps not, Loki conceded, but I knew it would happen. Still, no matter how beaten and broken they are without their casket or their king, each blow struck against them only fuels their fury. It may take centuries or millennia, but one day they will rise again and plague Asgard. As long as any frost giant lives, Asgard will never be safe. Sif sighed. Loki was still on his genocidal bent then. If Thor really called this progress, then she really didn't want to know the state that he had found Loki in. Or maybe Thor was just being overly optimistic, as usual. Fandral cleared his throat. Well, we're all for killing frost giants but not unprovoked. A flash of something in Loki's eyes, gone too fast for Sif to identify it. Oh, I know. No matter what else may have happened, say directly before that back on Midgard, killing Loki and saving your father, that was good, Fandral continued. And we do recognize your remarkable achievement. That's all I ask, Loki said dryly. Thor had apparently seen enough, for he sauntered into the room then. Hello, friends. Thor, Loki greeted, nodding. Did you find what you went to go fetch? Thor nodded. Indeed. What was it? Loki asked. Thor just smiled at that. It's a secret thing. He grabbed a plate and loaded it with more food than was meant to go on one plate. Still, if he made a mess, it wasn't his job to clean it up. He sat down next to Loki and appeared not to notice how Loki immediately moved his chair over further from Thor. So, how is your reunion going? Thor asked, not even trying to go for subtle. Then again, Thor was never very good at it, so perhaps that was for the best. It's like I never left, Loki said smoothly. Sif frowned at that. She was pretty sure that things had gone better before he had taken the throne. Well, at least for most of them. Who knew how Loki remembered it happening? They at least had found him easier to talk to and didn't have to walk around on so many eggshells. Thor looked questioningly at them. We managed to find things to talk about, Hogun said at last. I'm glad, Thor said happily. The sooner you guys are friends again, the sooner we can put this whole unfortunate incident behind us. Things will not just go back to how you want them to be, Thor, no matter how much effort you put into it, Loki said firmly. Who said anything about going back? Thor asked him. I was happy with how things were, but clearly there were some issues and I've changed a lot since then. Even had none of this happened, just my time on Earth would have made it impossible for us to go on as before. You speak as though you realize this truth, but your actions run counter to this, Loki noted. Mostly just for the sake of disagreeing with Loki, Sif decided to share an opinion. Just because we can never go back doesn't mean that we have to change everything. We can move forward keeping much the same and only changing that which must be changed. Loki shot her a deeply annoyed look and Sif merely smiled pleasantly back at him. That is it exactly, Thor exclaimed, happy that she was apparently on board with his plan. But in order to find this new path, we must all endure a little awkwardness in order to move past recent events. Loki snorted. We all? Since when have you ever been awkward about anything? Volstagg let out a startled laugh. He has a point there, Thor. I watched you grow up. Thor rolled his eyes tolerantly. I was trying to be modest. Oh, I've never seen the point of that, Fandral said, brushing a bit of hair out of his eyes. Embrace your wonderful immunity to awkwardness, Thor. For you, Fandral, I shall, Thor said solemnly. I see no reason to cooperate if you aren't going to be giving me a choice, Loki said, a little sullenly. Thor turned to Loki and, with the air of one repeating a familiar argument, said, Of course you have a choice, Loki. We're giving you the choice to make the right choice. You're letting me choose to do something I have no choice about, Loki concluded. I'm really starting to wonder if you really grasp this whole choice thing. It's not your only choice, Thor disagreed. You could always sulk for all of eternity. Loki scowled. I do not sulk. We can see that, Sif said innocently. Loki looked like he dearly wished to throw something at her, but, for now at least, he had more self-control than that. All in all, their first encounter with Loki after that time he went crazy and evil really could have gone far worse. I can't have heard you correctly, Loki said, having a horrible feeling that he did. In fact, here's Stark just fine. Stark laughed, probably guessing what was running through his mind. I'll tell you again just so we're sure that we're all on the same page here. Sometimes older people have difficulty crossing the street, especially with those ridiculously short crosswalk times. I mean, you had better be either standing right on the curb waiting to go or you have to wait until the next cycle. And you need to walk fast, too. I think that we can all agree. Well, Thor and I agree. That older people getting hit by cars and screwing up the traffic flow is a bad thing and we want to avoid it. We are also concerned about the people being struck by traffic, Thor added. Stark nodded. Right, them. So I'm just supposed to stand here at the corner and ask frail-looking people if they need help walking from one side to the other? Loki asked incredulously. Stark nodded. Pretty much, although they might come up to you. Is it customary on Earth for older people to come up to strangers and ask for assistance walking across the street? Loki asked. Stark shrugged. I can't say. No one's ever come up to me, but then I generally don't walk places. I'm just going to be standing out here doing nothing for hours, Loki predicted. You could also assist those with disabilities, Thor suggested. Stark snapped. Right, exactly. And I put an ad out anyway so people will know that if they want assistance crossing the street, they should come to you. So I'll either be ignored or mobbed by people here to take advantage of me. Perfect, Loki said bitterly. Stark smirked. Welcome to New York. You can get started out here. I'm going to go see about buying that Starbucks over there. Don't you mean buying something at that Starbucks? Thor asked him. Stark shook his head. No, I do not. With that, he turned and started to walk away. Hey, he called back to the woman who had came with him, aren't you coming? Potts shook her head. One of us has to be responsible. I'm being plenty responsible, Stark insisted. I'm building up my company. Impulse buying stores does not count as being responsible, Potts retorted. Oh, and staying outside with the supervillain does? Stark demanded. Without your suit, I'm not safer without you here than with you here, Potts pointed out. Stark groaned. You're really not making me feel any better about this, Pepper. Then you'd better hurry back, Potts said sweetly. Grumbling, Stark continued to leave. The minute he was gone, Loki turned to Thor. I can't believe you did that. Thor frowned. I'm at a loss as to what I'm supposed to have done. You abandoned me to talk to those people, Loki complained. Thor got an annoyingly knowing look on his face. Those people, Loki? You mean our friends? No, I mean your friends. If I had meant our friends, then I would have said that, Loki snapped. Thor sighed. I know that that was not easy for any of you, but I truly believe that the worst is behind us and now we can move forward and all be friends again. I do not want to be friends with them, Loki informed Thor coldly. Thor rolled his eyes. No, of course not. What you want is to behave so unfriendly that they will eventually give up and not wish to be your friend. Then, of course, you can claim that you were right all along and they never liked you. They don't wish to be my friend, either, Thor, Loki insisted. Don't put this all on me. Of course they do, Thor exclaimed. Why do you think they agreed to talk to you this morning? Loyalty to you, of course, Loki replied. There is not much they will not do for you. They will invade Jotunheim alone for you. So did you, once upon a time, Thor said quietly. Loki looked away, annoyed. We were never supposed to have gotten there. And yet when we did you stayed by my side, Thor pointed out. Loki did not want to discuss that anymore. It was before he found out the truth, anyway, and so therefore it really didn't count. He turned to Potts. Is your name really Pepper? It's actually Virginia, Potts told him, but I never liked that name, too much teasing. So you decided to call yourself Pepper, Loki said incredulously. What were you teased about with Virginia? Thor inquired. It sounds like a perfectly lovely name to me. Potts smiled at Thor. Thank you. Virginia is the name of a state, though, and I grew up there so everyone always made a stupid joke. I didn't actually choose the name Pepper. People started calling me that because of my freckles and I sort of liked the alliteration so I stuck with it. I don't understand, Thor said, frowning. What does Pepper have to do with having freckles? Potts shrugged. I'm not actually sure. I just know that that's the explanation everyone gave me. Maybe my face looks like someone sprinkled pepper on it. That still seems like a strange connection to make, Thor insisted. Maybe, Potts agreed, but it's one plenty of people made. And I got some teasing about being a pepperpot there, too, but by then I had learned to ignore people like that. And so you chose to rise above it instead of letting a grudge build up over centuries and then using that to justify whatever bad decision you happened to make, Thor said, nodding. I must commend you for that. Potts looked at him a little oddly. Thank you, of course. I don't have centuries that I could dedicate to holding grudges. But if you did then you would not waste them doing that, right? Thor asked. I don't believe so, Potts confirmed. Loki decided to simply not acknowledge that because if he didn't then Thor would be forced to either let the matter drop or actually spell out what he was saying. Besides, the slights against him had been far worse than simply having his name made fun of. He didn't actually think his name had ever been made fun of, actually. A young woman with a clearly fake limp walked up to him then, her friend standing a little ways behind her and giggling like crazy. Hello, can you help me cross the street? She asked, holding out her arm. It took Loki a second to actually process the fact that this was his life and that this was, in fact, actually happening to him. Thor would likely be perfectly willing to help, perhaps even eager. But, as he had been painfully aware of for as long as he could remember, he wasn't Thor and never could be. Loki glared at her. There is nothing wrong with you, physically, and if there were your friends could aid you. Brother, Thor admonished, you're here to help people. And weren't you just upset that you didn't think you would have anything to do? I did not realize you were worried you would have no one to help because you were planning on refusing to help everyone? But the girl was not deterred. Her arm was still out expectantly and she was gazing dreamily at him. Loki sighed deeply but he took her arm and stood by the crosswalk with her. When the walk signal appeared, the two of them made their way to the other side of the street. She walked noticeably slower across the street than she had to the curb. Can I have my picture taken with you? She asked once they were on the other side, not releasing his arm. No, Loki said flatly, prying her fingers off of her arm. There was a strange sound and one of the friends cried, "Got it." The girl inexplicably tried to hug him but was automatically repelled by his magic. He liked his personal space, after all, even if Thor seemed somehow immune to his natural space preserver. And then, because he didn't want to wait until the next walk sign to get back over to Thor and Potts, and he did not want to stand around by himself, he teleported back to the other side of the street. He wondered what it said about these people that, though they had no magic themselves and he had just publicly tried to conquer their planet, they didn't even bat an eye at his rather showy teleportation. Not that he minded, he was just curious and a bit concerned. What Xaid monded? Why would someone pretend that they needed assistance? Were they trying to annoy me? And why did she want a picture? Potts was on the losing end of a fight with a smile. Well, he asked testily. I think that she might be a fan, Potts explained. Loki frowned, but Thor looked just as confused, and so he decided to let him ask the question. What do you mean by a fan? Thor inquired. I think that she is either misguided and thinks trying to conquer the world makes your brother cool, or she thinks he's attractive, Potts explained. Either way, the fact her friends were there means she probably wouldn't have done it alone, but people can do some pretty silly things when they get together. So the fact that they either think that what Loki did was cool, or find him attractive means that they are no longer scared of him and want to annoy him, Thor asked slowly. I wouldn't say that they're looking to annoy him, Potts prevaricated, and I never said it was smart. But there you have it. Tony's had his share of fangirls over the years, and it's been my job to deal with it. Unless he wanted to sleep with them, and then I dealt with it afterwards. So I can give you some pointers if you're interested. I'll be fine, Loki bit out, annoyed that she thought that he needed her help in dealing with annoying humans with no sense of self-preservation. The next 3 people he helped across the street were just looking to annoy him because they kept glaring at him. It's pretty brave of them to do that, Potts marveled. And if Thor weren't here, then I'd call them very stupid. As it is, that's still not a good plan. What are they even accomplishing? Loki wondered. I'm going to be out here anyway. Potts shrugged. Well, how else are they going to express their irritation at what you did? Blogging about it. But hey, nothing's stopping them from doing both. The next person who came up to him was actually an old woman who regarded with neither admiration nor contempt. Loki's attention was caught by what he could only assume to be a red-clad superhero, or villain, perhaps, of some kind, who was on the side of one of those obscenely tall buildings. He hadn't been there a few moments ago. Was he watching him? Was that an arrogant thought or just a properly paranoid one? He was certainly facing Loki's direction. Loki escorted the old woman to the curb. Well, isn't this nice? The old woman told him, tightening her grip on the bag of groceries that she held in her other hand. Thor kept gesturing to him like he was supposed to do something, steal her bag. Perhaps, that didn't sound like Thor, but Loki wasn't sure what, and so he decided to ignore him. It is so nerve-wracking crossing these busy intersections sometimes, the old woman continued. I never know how much time I'm going to have before the light turns red, and I worry about being hit by one of these impatient drivers. Loki nodded like he was listening, and, when the walk sign appeared, he stepped out into the street. Sometimes there is a countdown to how many seconds I have, and that is helpful, the old woman went on. But then again, it makes me feel like I'm under pressure to cross the street in just the right amount of time. Oh, it's not so bad when I'm not tired or my hands are empty, but so often I'm one or the other. At least that's better than with stop signs. People usually stop at stoplights, but I get so worried that they won't when it comes to stoplights. This old woman was really insipid. For all that she worried about not having enough time to cross the street, she had certainly made the half a minute or so that it had taken them to cross together seem like it had taken at least 20 times as long. In that way, she actually reminded him of Thor. Fortunately, the content of her speech, insipid though it may be, was not what was so offensive, but just the fact that she was speaking to him at all. If he had to listen to someone ranting at him and wasn't permitted to rant back, with the penalty for not listening being a special Thor lecture that he would inevitably decide was worth it at the moment and then proceed to regret for the several hours afterwards, then chances were that there would be a death or two, and who even knew how that would go over. Not well, certainly. Oh, thank you, young man, the old woman said when they reached the other side. You're very kind. Loki just blinked at her, trying to remember the last time that anyone had called him kind. He gave up after a moment because anything that required him to think that far back was too depressing to recall. Needless to say, it had been a while if it had ever happened. This woman was quite clearly out of touch with reality. The old woman was still waiting for an answer. You're welcome, Loki said quietly before teleporting away. Thor looked at him closely, Who? Loki demanded. Is that? He pointed towards the man in red who, right in front of his eyes, released something from his hand and used it to start swinging from building to building away from them. I can answer that question, Stark said, and they turned around to see him waiting there. He was holding a tray with 3 coffee cups and 1 bottle of water. He had actually been standing there for a few minutes, so Loki could only assume that he was waiting for the opportunity to make an impressive entrance or something equally ridiculous. Of course you can, Potts said fondly. The question is, will you? I'm feeling generous, Stark decided. He gave her a brief kiss and then started handing the cups out. He gave Loki the bottle of water. I didn't know what you liked. Thor looked pleased at how friendly Stark was being, but Loki could see the truth. It was friendlier than not getting Loki anything at all, but they all received beverages he had been assured was delicious while he had gotten water. What took you so long? Potts asked him. Stark didn't look at her. I bought the frozen yogurt shop next to Starbucks, too. I would have gotten us some, but I only had so many hands and I don't actually like frozen yogurt. Potts rolled her eyes. Tony, what? He asked innocently. Now, the woman crossing the street was May Parker. And? Loki asked. And her nephew Peter Parker is Spider-Man, so obviously he was concerned that his aunt was planning on having you help her across the street. Hence, his presence here, Stark continued. Why did I have to explain that? I feel like I shouldn't have to have explained that. Potts was giving him a pointed look. Stark's eyes widened. Right, he wants to keep his identity a secret for some reason. Got it. I always did think that was a stupid plan. That doesn't mean you should go around telling everyone, Potts exclaimed. I didn't tell everyone, Stark protested. Just Thor and Loki and I. For one, I'm confident that Thor will keep this secret. Why does he want his identity to remain a secret? Thor asked, confused. Stark shrugged. Oh, who even knows? Probably something stupid. He doesn't want the attention all the time as he wants to live a normal life when in civilian mode, Potts replied. Stark nodded to himself. I was right, it was a stupid reason. Not everyone is as eager to be in the limelight as you are, Tony, Potts told him. Yeah, because they hate awesomeness, Stark remarked. And he's probably also trying to protect his friends and family. Supervillains do have a tendency to go after those, Potts pointed out. Stark shrugged. That doesn't seem like a very good reason either. Villains have a bad habit of finding out who you are anyway, so no one is protected, and if you just don't let the people you care about get kidnapped, or at least rescue them, then it all works out. Loki was saved further domestic bickering when another old woman came up to him. Hopefully, this one wouldn't have any annoying super relatives who had nothing better to do than to stare at him. Another week passed before Loki was done spending his days walking back and forth across the street. Really, the fact that there were people who either legitimately needed assistance walking just a few feet or, for whatever reason, were going to pretend that they did nothing to endear the mortals of Midgard to him. No one was quite that pathetic, either physically or otherwise, on Asgard, and he tried to imagine what would happen if someone did need that sort of help. He just couldn't. They'd probably go hide in shame or try to end it all or something, and he couldn't blame him. If he ever got so pathetic, that was what he'd do. But since he could teleport, it was unlikely that he ever had to worry about such a day coming. And Thor, being Thor, wouldn't have to worry about it either. Just because. Thor wouldn't tell him what his next endeavor was, and since Thor had been so accommodating up until this point, Loki knew that this would be something that Loki absolutely hated. As they walked along the street, Loki tried to appeal to Thor's reason. If you're not going to tell me where we're going, then how can we teleport there? We're not going to. Thor replied easily. So you're going to fly us? Loki asked unhappily. He hated it when Thor flew him anywhere. Neither of them could actually fly, but Mjolnir could, and Thor was the only one who could lift that, and so it always amounted to Thor flying around and Loki having to uncomfortably cling to him. Sure, Thor offered to carry him, but Loki would rather risk plummeting to his death than have Thor literally carry him. And with his magic, actually falling to his death was a much less likely possibility anyway. Thor shook his head again. Not this time, brother. Loki frowned, trying to understand what was going to happen. You didn't bring a car. Well spotted, brother, Thor said in that slightly mocking tone that Loki had always hated but used so much more effectively than Thor did. Loki nearly stopped as a horrifying thought occurred to him. You're not going to make us walk to wherever we're going, are you? Thor chuckled. Would that really be so bad? We walked all the time back on Asgard. Loki's eyes darkened at the mention of the time before. That was Asgard and this is Midgard and I dislike walking here. Will we be walking to our destination? Well, we are and we aren't, Thor said cryptically. Thor didn't really do cryptic. Loki's eyes narrowed. Tell me. We are walking to the subway station and then, once we get off, we will be walking a little further to get to that place where we are going, Thor explained. Was that an almost slip-up or was Thor just trying to torture him? Honestly, it could be either at this point and Loki wasn't sure which one he preferred. The latter explanation fit more in line with how he preferred to view things, but the former hinted that Thor might be tricked into revealing the information that he sought. Not that he doubted that, either way, he could trick Thor. He always fell for the trick where he wasn't standing where he seemed to be standing, after all. It would be almost sad should Thor actually learn from that one. What in the world is a subway? Loki asked, puzzled. Right down there, Thor said, pointing to a set of stairs right in front of them that led underneath the ground. You realize, of course, that I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's down there, Loki said flatly. But where is the adventure in that? Thor asked, surprised. I am not here for adventure, Thor, Loki ground out. I know that, but it is certainly an added bonus, yes? Thor asked. Loki merely crossed his arms and waited. Thor had never been a patient man and so he did not have long to wait. A subway is just a train that moves around in the city and is often underground. Why in the world would we need to take a subway when there are several viable alternatives that do not involve being crammed in an underground train with humans? Loki demanded. According to Clint, you cannot be considered a real New Yorker until you have ridden the subway, Thor said as if that explained anything. What was the difference between a real New Yorker and a fake one anyway? And what did it matter to him? Why in the world would I want to be a New Yorker, real or otherwise? Loki asked, raising an eyebrow. Hey, man, you're blocking the subway, an annoyed man said from behind them. Loki didn't deign to turn around to glare, but Thor quickly stepped out of the man's way. Damn tourists, he muttered. I'm having enough issues being anything but Asgardian, Loki reminded him. Thor rubbed the back of his neck. There is that. But you don't have to be a human to be a New Yorker, so this is different. You can ride the subway without me, Thor, Loki said patiently. But I wanted to share in the experience with you, Thor exclaimed. Loki rolled his eyes. Lucky me. Of course, Natasha was in the room and she and Clint compiled a list of other things that you had to do to be a real New Yorker and this seemed like the easiest to accomplish, Thor admitted. I don't even want to know what the others are, Loki told him. Thor, being Thor, didn't listen. Apparently you have to have lived in New York for at least 10 years. I have not done that, but I could easily do it at some point. Please don't, Loki requested. Thor brightened. It would bother you if I were gone from Asgard for so long, brother? Only because I expect that you would try to keep me here with you and I don't think I could take 1 year on this miserable planet, much less 10, Loki replied. You wanted to conquer the Earth forever, Thor pointed out. Then isn't it a good thing I didn't succeed? Loki asked dryly. Apparently you must also have killed a cockroach with your bare hands. I have yet to see a cockroach, but Bruce assures me that I'm just not looking hard enough, Thor continued. A shoe would be much more practical, and more hygienic, than a hand, and that's if you're lacking in a better weapon or magic, Loki declared. You also have to have stolen someone's cab and not felt guilty for it, be able to give a cab driver directions, when you know entire neighborhoods to avoid on the weekend, and when you can leave for a year and everyone you vaguely knew still remembers you, Thor continued. You have to stop being indignant about the cost of rent, live through a disaster, and not care when you see a celebrity. You have to know all of the stops on any given subway line, scream at cars who almost hit you even when you don't cross at the crosswalk because cars are supposed to stop for you, and have your family come to New York to visit you instead of the other way around. You have to have a bagel place, stop bragging about living in New York, and get annoyed at everyone who moved to the city after you. So much? Loki asked, raising his eyebrows. It is a wonder that there are any real New Yorkers at all. It is something that many can aspire to but never achieve, Thor acknowledged. Apparently the most important thing is to not worry about being a real New Yorker. What do you know? Loki asked sardonically. I guess I'm on my way. With that, Loki decided to actually go down into the subway to get it over with. He dutifully pretended not to know Thor while the latter was trying to figure out how the ticket system worked, and then he waited on the platform for the train to come. He wasn't sure if Thor knew how to get on the right one, but if he didn't, then Loki would simply have to ignore what Thor wanted and teleport himself to where they were going. Or teleport himself back to the Avengers Tower if Thor still refused to tell him. This, Loki complained, feeling dirty for even being in such a place, is filthy. Well, Thor looked like he wanted to dispute that but wasn't quite sure how. At least we won't be here long. Loki smiled in grim satisfaction at that. When the train finally pulled in, it wasn't very crowded, but there was only one seat available when the train doors opened. Loki was pleased that an old man with a cane, a small child and her mother, and a man swaying unsteadily to the seat. Thor was glaring at him again, but Loki half suspected he was annoyed that he didn't get to the seat first. Granted, Thor would probably gallantly give it away in a very loud and public gesture, but still. Thor was forced to stand near him and hold onto the railing above his head. "I hope that this will not be a long journey," Loki said, eyeing the rail Thor was holding onto with disgust. It didn't look filthy, but it must have been with all of those humans touching it all of the time. Thor laughed. "I'm not going to tell you, brother. You're just going to have to wait until we get there to see." Loki frowned but said nothing, unwilling to be reduced to begging. The ride was dull, but he had been through duller moments. And slowly, stop by stop, the compartment began to fill with people. Thor was clearly displeased as he was jostled by people trying to find a place to stand, but there was nothing really to do. It wasn't so bad for Loki because no matter how many people got on the train, there were still only so many seats. At one point, Loki felt that it was impossible to fit any more people on the train because it was packed to capacity and far, far past the point of comfort. And then what did the silly humans do but cram yet more people onto the train? It made no sense. The trains came along every few minutes. Why not just wait? Were they really in that much of a hurry? But perhaps those trains would be just as full and they'd have to wait a long while before they were able to get inside of a normal-sized train. Loki hoped that the train would empty itself out some before they had to get off, as he did not relish the thought of having to push past the people in order to get off. Not that he would, of course. Loki glanced up at Thor, searching for an indication of how far away they were from their destination, and what he saw surprised him. At first glance, Thor looked just fine. He was a little cramped, certainly, but under the circumstances it was impossible not to be. Only someone as observant as Loki and who had known Thor for as long as he had would have seen the way that his eyes were a little too wide and his face just a bit too neutral, that his hands were holding onto the railings a bit too hard, and that his stance was almost battle-worthy. Loki wondered vaguely if Thor had problems with being in an enclosed space. Loki had once had issues with that himself, though it had never been from a crowd of people, since the crowds on Asgard had never really been allowed to touch their princes. It had been more the general unpleasantness of the situation coupled with the inability to escape if he so chose. The fact he might not have left was nothing compared to being given the option to. Once Loki had learned to teleport, his childish fear had faded. Was Thor feeling that way? Perhaps. And even if he wasn't, this ordeal would do nothing to put him in a good mood, and the last thing he wanted to deal with was a petulant Thor. He barely even noticed when he enlarged the compartment, and Thor certainly didn't. It was for the best, as Thor really didn't deserve to know what he'd done. "No," Loki said flatly. "You haven't even tried it," Thor protested. He should have known that Loki would make this difficult. Had, in fact, known it, and that was why he had put off on telling him. He might never have gotten Loki in that subway otherwise. And while he could not say that it had been a pleasant experience, it had certainly been one worth having. "I don't need to in order to know that it is going to be a problem," Loki told him. "Is this why nobody else wanted to come? Because we were doing this?" "They were busy," Thor said virtuously. "They were at a battered women's shelter, but they wouldn't be so much as meeting any of the women. No, this shelter was where the laundry for all of the various shelters in the area was done. Loki's job would be to sort it." The others thought that it would be safer if Loki did not have much contact with people while helping out, and Thor agreed because he rather thought Loki would prefer it that way himself. Unless, of course, Loki realized what they were doing and why. Then he would just demand to be put in a position to directly help people, regardless of the fact that it ran counter to his own desires. Loki really was terrible about fighting against what he wanted in order to prove a point or as a matter of principle, and Thor would never understand that. This is going to take forever, Loki complained, staring up at the massive pile of laundry. Thor had to admit that this was one of the more daunting tasks he had ever been faced with, and this did not even require him to kill anything. But killing something was unlikely to take hours like this was. There was an entire supply closet, fairly large as far as supply closets go and easily about the size of a bedroom, that was half full with a mountain of trash bags. But it was what was in those trash bags, the towels and pillowcases and sheets and blankets, that was what was so intimidating. They all had to be sorted according to what they were and then rebagged using the same bags and hoping that they hadn't been torn when being opened. Thor was particularly worried about that, as sometimes he had a tendency to overdo it with his strength. And even if he was careful, what was to say that the bags wouldn't already be torn coming to them? Loki might be able to do something about that if he was inclined to, but one could never tell with Loki. In this case it would make less work, but it would also require him to actually be helpful when he didn't want to be here. Then we had best get started, Thor said, hoping he sounded more enthused than he felt. He knew that this was extremely important, of course, and without this what must literally be thousands of people would not get a bed to sleep in, but it just seemed so menial. Not that he would ever admit this to Loki. What's the point? Loki asked, still eyeing the pile with mounting horror. It will just replenish itself. I might have to come back week after week and keep doing this, forever. I'm sure my friends will have another task for you before long, Thor assured him. Loki finally tore his eyes away from the pile long enough to roll them at Thor. Joy. Since Loki wasn't moving, it was clearly up to Thor himself to start, and he walked over to one of the bags and back out to the space cleared for sorting. He opened up the bag and started pulling the items out and sorting them. If you do it that way then it really will take forever, Loki said, shaking his head. Not everyone was blessed with the gift of magic, Loki, Thor said calmly as he continued to sort. Evidently, Loki said dryly. He waved a hand and 4 bags flew out of the supply room, unknotted themselves, and had their content float up into the air where Loki directed it to its pile. So now it's the gift of magic, is it? Yes, Thor said slowly, uncertain where exactly Loki was going with this. Not the curse of magic? Not my tricks? Loki asked, seemingly casual. Thor fought the urge to roll his eyes. Loki may get upset about a great deal of silly things, but clearly laughing at the silliness had not done his relationship with Loki, or Loki's relationship with the real world, any favors over the years. No, Thor said quietly. Not either of those. Loki didn't seem to know what to say to that. It would take me having to save you from being buried in dirty laundry for you to actually acknowledge me. Loki admitting that he was now being acknowledged, if only about this. Well, that looked like progress. He was really getting good at this whole redeeming thing, wasn't he?